The most famous WWE movie scene everyone knows by heart, complete Hollywood fiction. While you've been memorizing these historical moments, the real stories were being buried. Tonight we're exposing 100 lies that fooled entire generations, and the shocking truth behind what actually happened. When you watch a World War II movie, you're probably expecting to see brave soldiers charging into battle without fear. Hollywood loves showing us these superhuman warriors who never seem scared, always make the right decisions, and somehow look good even after 3 days of combat. Well, here's the thing about real soldiers. They were nothing like that. Most of the men who fought in World War II were just regular guys. We're talking about 18-year-olds who had probably never been more than 50 miles from home before getting shipped off to Europe or the Pacific. These weren't action heroes with perfect aim and nerves of steel. They were teenagers who missed their moms, worried about their girlfriends back home, and had no idea what they were doing half the time. The reality: fear was everywhere. Not the dramatic cinematic fear that gets resolved in 2 hours, but the constant gnawing anxiety that ate at soldiers every single day. They were scared of dying, sure, but they were also scared of looking cowardly in front of their buddies, scared of making mistakes that could get someone killed, and scared they'd never see home again. Personal diaries from the war tell a completely different story than what you see on screen. Soldiers wrote about being so terrified they couldn't sleep. They described throwing up before battles, shaking uncontrollably during air raids, and crying when they thought nobody was looking. One soldier wrote to his sister about how he pretended to be sick just to avoid going on a patrol. Another described watching a friend break down completely and refuse to leave his foxhole. These weren't weak men. They were human beings dealing with impossible situations. But Hollywood doesn't want to show you the soldier who spent 3 hours hiding behind a tree because he was too scared to move forward. That doesn't sell movie tickets. Then there's the exhaustion factor that movies completely ignore. Real soldiers were bone-tired almost all the time. They carried heavy packs for miles, slept in mud, went days without proper food, and dealt with everything from dysentery to trench foot. Try making heroic decisions when you haven't had a decent meal in a week and your boots are falling apart. The weird part is how movies make every soldier look like they graduated from some elite military academy. In reality, many of these guys had barely finished basic training before they were thrown into combat. They learned on the job, often the hard way. Mistakes were incredibly common. Friendly fire incidents, getting lost, equipment failures, miscommunication that led to disasters. One veteran described his first battle experience like this: "I had no idea what I was supposed to be shooting at. There was smoke everywhere, people yelling, and I just pointed my rifle in the general direction everyone else was pointing and hoped for the best." Not exactly the precision combat you see in movies. Let's not forget that many soldiers never fired their weapons at all during the entire war. Some served in support roles, others were lucky enough to avoid direct combat, and quite a few simply couldn't bring themselves to shoot at another human being when the moment came. Studies after the war showed that a surprising number of soldiers deliberately aimed high or wide to avoid actually killing someone. The mental toll was enormous too. Soldiers dealt with what we now call PTSD, though back then they just called it shell shock or combat fatigue. Men would develop nervous tics, stop speaking entirely, or have violent nightmares. But in the movies, everyone just shrugs off trauma and keeps fighting like nothing happened. Real soldiers also got sick constantly. Food poisoning, malaria, infections from minor cuts that turned serious. These things knocked out more soldiers than enemy bullets did. Hollywood heroes never seemed to catch so much as a cold, let alone spend 2 weeks laid up with some tropical disease they picked up from drinking bad water. The truth is, most soldiers were just trying to survive each day and hopefully make it home in one piece. They weren't thinking about glory or becoming heroes. They were thinking about their next meal, staying warm, avoiding disease, and maybe getting a letter from home. When they did show courage, it was often because they were more afraid of letting down their buddies than they were of the enemy. But here's something that might surprise you even more than the reality of who these soldiers really were. Many of them didn't even volunteer to be there in the first place. The idea that World War II was fought entirely by eager volunteers ready to serve their country is another Hollywood myth that needs some serious fact-checking. Looking at those heroic volunteers charging into battle in war movies, well, here's the thing. Nobody talks about most of them weren't volunteers at all. They were drafted. The US government essentially said, "Surprise, you're going to war to over 10 million American men during World War II. That's not exactly the inspiring recruitment poster image Hollywood loves to sell us. The selective service system worked like a massive lottery nobody wanted to win. Young men between 18 and 45 had to register, and then Uncle Sam picked names. Your number came up, pack your bags. It didn't matter if you were planning to marry your sweetheart next month, or starting your dream job. The war needed bodies, and your body just got selected. But wait, it gets more interesting. The draft wasn't some random grab bag either. Local draft boards made the decisions, and these boards reflected their community's biases. Rich kids often got deferments for college or essential jobs. Poor kids, not so much. Rural communities sometimes protected their farm boys during harvest season, while urban areas had different priorities. The system tried to be fair, but fairness is subjective when your life's on the line. Then there's the uncomfortable truth about enthusiasm levels. Movies show eager young men practically racing to enlist, fists pumping with patriotic fervor. Reality check: many draftees were about as excited as you'd be for a root canal. They went because they had to, not because they dreamed of storming beaches under enemy fire. Some guys tried everything to avoid the draft. Suddenly everyone discovered mysterious health problems they'd never mentioned before. Bad backs, weak hearts, essential flat feet, anything that might earn a 4th classification and a ticket home. Others claimed conscientious objector status, though that came with its own complications and social stigma. A few even fled to Canada, though that option carried serious consequences. The diversity of draftees would surprise you too. Hollywood typically shows clean-cut farm boys from Iowa, but the draft pulled from everywhere. City kids who'd never seen a cow found themselves next to farm boys who'd never seen a skyscraper. College graduates bunked with high school dropouts. The military became an accidental melting pot, mixing backgrounds that rarely intersected in civilian life. Training these reluctant warriors presented unique challenges. Career military officers suddenly had to transform unwilling draftees into fighting units. Many recruits arrived with zero interest in learning how to kill people in foreign countries. Drill sergeants had their work cut out for them, turning sullen teenagers into soldiers who could follow orders under pressure. The speed of training often suffered because of sheer volume. Processing millions of draftees meant cutting corners. Basic training that might normally take months got compressed into weeks. Some units shipped overseas with barely adequate preparation simply because the war couldn't wait for perfect soldiers. What's fascinating is how this affected unit cohesion. Volunteer units often shared common motivation and background. Draft units were more like random collections of strangers thrown together by bureaucratic necessity. Building trust and teamwork among people who didn't choose to be there required different leadership approaches. Military records reveal another twist. Many drafted soldiers actually performed better than expected once they accepted their situation. Turns out being forced into service doesn't automatically make you a bad soldier. Some of the war's most decorated units included significant numbers of draftees who found courage they didn't know they possessed. The psychological impact deserves mention too. Volunteers could tell themselves they chose their fate. Draftees had to cope with having their lives completely redirected by forces beyond their control. This fundamental difference in agency affected how soldiers processed combat stress and trauma. Letters home from drafted soldiers often carried different tones than those from volunteers. Less fighting for freedom rhetoric, more just trying to survive and get home. Their families worried differently too, knowing their sons hadn't chosen this path. Let's not forget the draft also created interesting social dynamics. Communities that sent mostly draftees sometimes felt less invested in the war effort compared to areas with high volunteer rates. This affected everything from bond sales to factory production, creating subtle but real impacts on the home front. The weird part is Hollywood's reluctance to acknowledge this reality. Maybe forced military service doesn't test well with focus groups. Maybe audiences prefer heroes who choose their destiny rather than having it chosen for them. Either way, the entertainment industry consistently rewrites this fundamental aspect of how America actually fought World War II. Understanding the draft's role changes how we interpret soldier behavior and military effectiveness. When millions of your fighting force never wanted to be there in the first place, their eventual performance becomes even more remarkable. But that's just the beginning of what Hollywood gets wrong about actual combat experience. Picture the typical World War II movie scene. Explosions everywhere, bullets flying, soldiers charging across battlefields in dramatic slow motion. The action never stops. Heroes leap from cover to cover, guns blazing, as epic music swells in the background. Every moment feels like life or death combat. Well, here's the thing that Hollywood won't tell you. Most of World War II was actually boring as hell. Real soldiers spent weeks sitting in trenches, staring at empty fields. They'd wait for hours just to move a few hundred yards. Rain would pour down for days while they huddled in muddy holes, playing cards or writing letters home. One soldier from the 101st Airborne wrote to his sister, "We've been here 6 days now and haven't seen a single German. Just mud, more mud, and cold beans." The weird part is that this boredom was often worse than combat itself. At least during battles, adrenaline kicked in and time moved fast. But sitting in a foxhole for 3 weeks, that's when your mind really started playing tricks on you. Soldiers would count raindrops, memorize every crack in their rifle stocks, or have entire conversations with imaginary friends just to stay sane. Then there's the waiting game that drove everyone crazy. Orders would come down to prepare for attack at dawn, and the men would gear up, check their weapons and psyche themselves up for battle. Dawn would come and go, no attack. They'd wait another day, still nothing. Sometimes they'd wait a full week before anything happened, and by then their nerves were completely shot from anticipation. Movies love showing soldiers as always ready for action, but the reality was different. After sitting still for days when combat finally came, many guys could barely remember how to use their equipment properly. Their muscles were stiff, their reflexes slow, and their gear had gotten muddy or waterlogged from sitting around. Let's not forget about the strange quiet moments that filled most days. Between battles, soldiers would find themselves in eerily peaceful situations. They'd sit in destroyed French villages, listening to birds chirp in the ruins. Some wrote poetry, others carved wooden trinkets. Many just stared at the horizon, wondering what their families were doing back home. But here's where it gets really interesting. These quiet times were often filled with more fear than the actual fighting. During combat, you're too busy to think much. Your training kicks in, and you react. But during those long empty hours, that's when the terror crept in. Soldiers would lie awake at night, listening to every sound, wondering if that rustling bush meant an enemy patrol was nearby. One Marine in the Pacific wrote in his diary, "It's been 4 days since we heard gunfire. You'd think I'd be happy about that. Instead, I keep checking my rifle every 10 minutes and jumping at shadows. The waiting is killing me worse than any Japanese soldier ever could." And the weird part is that Hollywood rarely shows how homesickness hit hardest during these boring stretches. When you're fighting for your life, you don't have time to miss your mom's cooking or wonder what your girlfriend is doing. But sit a guy in a muddy hole for 2 weeks with nothing but time to think. He'll write 17 letters home and probably cry into his helmet at least once. Weather made everything worse too. Movies show brief rainstorms that add drama to battle scenes. Real war meant spending months in constant dampness. Soldiers' feet would rot in their boots. Their clothes never dried. Everything smelled like mildew and unwashed bodies. One guy from the European theater joked in a letter, "I've been wet so long, I think I'm growing gills." The boredom led to some pretty creative entertainment. Soldiers would bet on which raindrop would reach the bottom of their foxhole first. They'd have contests to see who could balance their helmet on their rifle longest. Some units even organized elaborate practical jokes that took weeks to plan and execute, just to break up the monotony. What really gets overlooked is how this downtime affected morale more than battles did. Losing a firefight was scary, but at least something had happened. Sitting around doing nothing for weeks while knowing the enemy was out there somewhere, that drove more soldiers to mental breakdowns than actual combat ever did. Movies make every day look like D-Day. But the truth is that most soldiers went weeks without firing their weapons in anger. They'd clean their rifles obsessively. Not because they were using them, but because they had literally nothing else to do. Makes sense, right? War isn't a 2-hour action movie. It's months and years of human beings stuck in terrible conditions. Most of the time doing absolutely nothing except worrying about what might happen next. But speaking of those conditions, Hollywood gets another major detail completely wrong when it comes to what these soldiers were actually wearing and carrying. Hollywood costume departments have a dirty little secret. They mess up uniforms more than a new recruit on his first day of drill. Walk into any major war movie, and you'll spot soldiers wearing gear that didn't exist yet. Helmets from the wrong year, and boots that would make any veteran laugh out loud. Take Saving Private Ryan, arguably one of the most celebrated WWII films ever made. Even Spielberg's masterpiece stumbles when it comes to getting the details right. Those iconic American helmets, half of them are post-war models that soldiers never saw during actual combat. The chin straps are wrong, the paint jobs are too clean, and some of the insignia didn't exist until years after the war ended. But here's where it gets really messy. Movie studios love using modern reproductions because they're cheaper and easier to find. Real WWII gear is rare, expensive, and often too fragile for film sets. So what do? They slap together whatever looks close enough and hope nobody notices. Well, veterans notice. They always notice. One WWII vet famously walked out of a theater because the actors were wearing Vietnam-era boots. Another veteran pointed out that the ammunition pouches in a popular film were positioned upside down, something no real soldier would ever do because it meant losing all your bullets in the mud. Then there's the color problem that drives historians absolutely crazy. Many films show American uniforms in the wrong shade of green, or British uniforms that look more like modern camping gear than actual military issue. The wool used in real WWII uniforms had a specific texture and color that modern reproductions rarely match. Real uniforms faded differently, wore out in specific places, and had that lived-in look that movie costumes almost never capture. Speaking of lived-in looks, Hollywood has another major blind spot. Their uniforms are always too perfect, too clean, too well-fitted. Real soldiers didn't have personal tailors following them around Europe. They wore whatever size they could get, which meant most uniforms were either too big or too small. Sleeves hung loose, pants bunched up, and everything got dirty fast. And the weird part is how movies handle the gear itself. Real soldiers spent half their time fixing broken equipment with whatever they could find. Buttons fell off constantly, zippers broke when they existed at all. Soldiers sewed patches using thread from parachute cords, dental floss, or anything else they could scrounge up. Let's not forget the helmet situation, which gets botched in almost every film. German helmets in movies often use the wrong type of steel, have incorrect liner systems, or feature paint schemes that never existed. American helmets frequently show up with post-war modifications, and British helmets appear in battles where those units weren't even present. But why? Why do filmmakers keep making the same mistakes over and over again? The answer is surprisingly simple. Most audiences don't know the difference, and fixing these details costs serious money. Hiring military historians, sourcing authentic reproductions, and ensuring historical accuracy adds weeks to production schedules and thousands to budgets. The boot problem alone could fill an entire chapter. Movies routinely show soldiers wearing modern combat boots that weren't invented until decades after WWII ended. Real soldiers wore leather boots that leaked, fell apart in wet conditions, and provided minimal ankle support. Many soldiers stuffed newspaper or cardboard inside their boots to keep their feet dry, something you'll never see Tom Hanks doing on screen. Then there's the small details that completely escape Hollywood's attention. Real soldiers carried personal items in specific pockets, wore their gear in particular ways based on their unit's traditions, and had individual quirks that developed over months of combat. Movie soldiers all look identical, like they just stepped out of a military supply catalog. The ammunition situation gets even more ridiculous. Films show soldiers carrying perfectly organized gear with every piece of equipment in pristine condition. Reality was different. Ammunition belts frayed, pouches tore open, and soldiers often carried extra gear tied to their uniforms with shoelaces or wire. What really happened was soldiers became experts at field repairs and improvisation. They modified their gear constantly, traded items with other units, and made do with whatever they could find. A real WWII soldier looked more like a walking garage sale than the polished warriors we see in movies. Makes sense, right? Real war doesn't come with costume departments or equipment managers. It comes with mud, rain, and gear that breaks at the worst possible moment. But uniforms and equipment represent just the tip of Hollywood's accuracy problems. While costume departments struggle with buttons and boots, the film industry faces even bigger challenges when it comes to depicting the famous battles that defined the war. We've talked about how Hollywood gets the basics wrong. The soldiers, the gear, the daily grind. But wait until you hear what they do to the actual battles. The big famous ones that everyone knows. Yeah, those are butchered beyond recognition. Take the Battle of the Bulge, one of the biggest American defeats that turned into a comeback story. Hollywood loves this one. Problem is, they can't seem to figure out when it happened. Most movies show soldiers fighting in nice weather, maybe a little mud, some autumn leaves. Reality check. This battle happened in December 1944, during one of the worst European winters on record. We're talking about temperatures dropping to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers were literally freezing to death in their foxholes. The snow was so deep that tanks got stuck, entire divisions couldn't move because the roads were sheets of ice. American troops were caught so off guard that many didn't even have winter gear. They wrapped newspapers around their feet to prevent frostbite. But Hollywood, nah, winter is expensive to film. Let's just pretend it was a pleasant fall day. Then there's Pearl Harbor, and boy oh boy do movies mess this one up. The attack happened on December 7, 1941, starting at 7:48 a.m. It lasted about 2 hours total. 2 waves of Japanese planes, methodical and devastating. But that's not dramatic enough for Hollywood, apparently. Movies stretch it out, compress it, move events around like pieces on a chessboard. They show pilots having lengthy conversations during the attack, which is hilarious because the whole thing was so fast and chaotic that most people barely had time to figure out what was happening. And the weird part is how films completely ignore the timeline of what got hit when. The Japanese had specific targets, battleships first, then airfields, then everything else. They knew exactly what they were doing. Movies just show random explosions everywhere, like someone threw a handful of firecrackers into a bathtub. Let's not forget how Hollywood treats geography like a suggestion. The Battle of Midway gets moved to different islands depending on which movie you're watching. Normandy beaches get rearranged to look prettier on camera. The Burma campaign somehow happens in what looks suspiciously like Southern California. Directors seem to think audiences won't notice if they film a European battle in a desert, as long as the explosions are big enough. But here's what really gets veterans angry: the complete erasure of Allied contributions. D-Day wasn't just Americans hitting the beach. British and Canadian forces landed on 3 of the 5 beaches. French resistance fighters had been sabotaging German communications for months before the invasion. Polish pilots flew cover missions. But watch most Hollywood versions and you'd think the entire war was won by about 50 guys from Brooklyn and Texas. The Pacific Theater gets even weirder treatment. Islands that were crucial to the war effort don't even appear in movies. Battles that lasted weeks get compressed into afternoon skirmishes. The Battle of Guadalcanal stretched over 6 months, 6 months of brutal jungle fighting, disease, supply shortages, and naval battles. Movies show it as a quick island-hopping adventure where everyone looks surprisingly clean and well-fed. Speaking of clean, let's talk about how Hollywood handles the chaos factor. Real battles were messy disasters, where nobody knew what was happening half the time. Communications failed constantly, units got lost. Friendly fire incidents happened way more than anyone wants to admit. Orders arrived hours late or not at all. Commanders made decisions based on outdated information. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was America's first major ground engagement against German forces in North Africa. It was a complete disaster. American troops broke and ran. Equipment was abandoned. It was a harsh lesson in what real warfare looked like against experienced enemies. Hollywood's version: a noble struggle with valuable lessons learned. They completely skip the part where green American troops got schooled by veterans who'd been fighting for years. Weather played a huge role in almost every major battle, but movies treat it like background decoration. The Italian campaign got bogged down for months because of mud, not just a little mud, but knee-deep, equipment-swallowing, morale-crushing mud that made movement almost impossible. Soldiers spent more time fighting the elements than fighting Germans. Then there is the issue of timing. Battles didn't happen in convenient movie-length chunks. Some lasted days with brief, terrifying moments of combat separated by hours of waiting and confusion. Others stretched across months with the same units fighting over the same ground repeatedly. But that doesn't make for exciting cinema. So Hollywood compresses everything into neat 2-hour packages. The strangest part about all these inaccuracies is that the real stories are often more dramatic than the made-up versions. Reality had plot twists that would seem too crazy for fiction. But if you think Hollywood butchers the battles themselves, wait until you see what they do to the weapons and ammunition that fought them. When Hollywood shows a World War II soldier firing his rifle, something magical happens. The gun never jams. Bullets fly endlessly without reloading. Grenades explode like miniature atomic bombs, sending enemies flying through the air in slow motion. Machine guns spray death for minutes without overheating. Artillery shells land exactly where they're supposed to, creating perfect explosions that somehow leave the hero unharmed just 20 feet away. Real war, not even close. Let's start with the most basic weapon every soldier carried: their rifle. The famous M1 Garand that American troops used made a distinctive ping sound when empty. But here's what movies don't show you: these rifles jammed constantly. Mud, sand, rain, or just regular use could turn your trusty weapon into an expensive club. Soldiers spent hours cleaning their rifles because a dirty gun meant a dead soldier. The 8-round clip that made that famous ping sound, gone in seconds during a firefight, leaving you frantically reloading while bullets flew overhead. Machine guns present an even bigger Hollywood lie. Those dramatic scenes where soldiers spray bullets for what feels like forever. The real MG-42 German machine gun could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, but the barrel would overheat after just a few bursts. Crews had to carry spare barrels and change them regularly, or the gun would literally melt. American machine gunners faced the same problem. Fire too long, and your weapon becomes useless metal. Then there's the ammunition situation that drives real veterans crazy when they watch war movies. Soldiers in films seem to have bottomless pockets of bullets. Reality check. Ammunition was heavy, limited, and precious. Each bullet had weight. Carrying enough ammo for a long battle meant choosing between bullets and other essential gear like food or medical supplies. Many soldiers ran out of ammunition during crucial moments, forced to scavenge from dead enemies or retreating comrades. Grenades deserve their own reality check. Hollywood loves showing grenades that explode like small nuclear weapons, throwing people through the air and creating massive fireballs. The truth? Most grenades were designed to kill with shrapnel, not explosions. The blast radius was much smaller than movies suggest. A hand grenade might seriously injure someone within 15 feet, but it wasn't going to launch a grown man across a battlefield like a cannonball. Plus, the famous pull the pin and throw routine had a deadly catch. Grenades had a delay of several seconds, and sometimes that timing went wrong. Artillery represents perhaps the biggest gap between Hollywood and reality. Those perfectly placed cannon shots that always hit their targets. Artillery crews in World War II were basically making educated guesses most of the time. Without modern GPS or computers, hitting a specific target required mathematics, luck, and multiple attempts. Spotters would radio back adjustments, 100 yards left, 50 yards short. By the time they got the range right, the enemy had often moved. Weather made everything worse in ways that movies rarely show. Rain turned gunpowder damp and unreliable. Cold weather made metal parts brittle and mechanisms sluggish. Desert sand got into every moving part, grinding down precision machinery. Soldiers became part-time mechanics out of necessity, constantly maintaining and repairing their weapons with whatever materials they could find. The variety of weapons also gets Hollywood treatment that ignores reality. Movies love showing soldiers with the latest, greatest equipment. Many troops actually carried outdated rifles, wore mismatched gear, and used weapons that were already obsolete when the war started. Some American soldiers landed on beaches with rifles from World War I. British troops sometimes carried equipment that hadn't been updated since the 1800s. Budget constraints and supply problems meant that the standard issue gear was more like wishful thinking. Supply lines created constant weapon problems that never make it into films. A rifle without bullets is just an awkward club. Tanks without fuel become expensive bunkers. Artillery without shells turns into elaborate scarecrows. Many battles were won or lost based on which side could keep their weapons fed with ammunition and spare parts. Soldiers often fought with whatever they could find, mixing American rifles with German ammunition, or using enemy weapons when their own supplies ran out. Maintenance was a never-ending battle against entropy. Weapons required constant attention, cleaning and repair. A gun that worked perfectly in training could fall apart after a week of combat conditions. Soldiers became expert at field repairs, using wire, tape, and creativity to keep their weapons functioning. The perfectly maintained equipment shown in movies would have been a miracle on real battlefields. But Hollywood's biggest weapons myth might be the reliability factor. When a movie hero pulls the trigger, the gun fires. When a real soldier pulled the trigger, sometimes nothing happened. Misfires, jams, and mechanical failures were daily realities that could mean the difference between life and death. Speaking of mechanical failures, the vehicles that carried these weapons and soldiers tell their own story of Hollywood myths versus battlefield reality. When Hollywood makes war movies, they love showing shiny tanks rolling across battlefields and fighter planes soaring through perfect blue skies. The vehicles look brand new, engines purr like luxury cars, and everything works flawlessly. Reality? Not even close. Movies consistently use vehicles that didn't exist during the battles they're depicting. You'll see a 1944 Sherman tank in a scene supposedly set in 1941, or a P-51 Mustang fighter plane dogfighting over Pearl Harbor when those planes weren't even built yet. The film industry grabs whatever military hardware they can rent or borrow, regardless of whether it matches the timeline. And the weird part is, most viewers never notice these glaring errors. Take the famous Sherman tank for instance. Hollywood shows these machines as unstoppable steel beasts that never break down. Real Sherman tanks earned the nickname Ronsons from German soldiers because they caught fire so easily, like the cigarette lighter. Lights first time every time, the Ronson slogan went. Not exactly the invincible war machine you see on screen. Then there's the mechanical reliability issue that films conveniently ignore. Tanks broke down constantly, transmission problems, engine failures, thrown tracks. These weren't rare occurrences, they were daily headaches. Crews spent more time fixing their vehicles than fighting with them. One veteran mechanic reported that for every hour a tank spent in combat, it needed 3 hours of maintenance. Makes sense, right? You can't maintain complex machinery in muddy foxholes like you would in a garage. But why do movies skip this reality? Simple. Watching soldiers change oil and replace spark plugs doesn't sell tickets. Audiences want action, not automotive repair tutorials. Aircraft face even worse treatment in Hollywood's version of history. Directors love showing massive aerial battles with hundreds of planes filling the sky. The real air war involved far fewer aircraft per mission, and many never saw enemy fighters at all. Most bomber crews flew routine supply runs or reconnaissance flights. Boring stuff that doesn't make for exciting cinema. Fighter planes in movies never seem to run out of ammunition either. Pilots fire machine guns for minutes at a time, as if they carried unlimited rounds. Real fighter aircraft carried enough ammunition for about 15 seconds of continuous firing. 15 seconds. Pilots had to make every burst count because once they emptied their guns the mission was over. Let's not forget how pristine everything looks in war films. Jeeps arrive at the front lines looking like they just rolled off the assembly line. Fresh paint, clean windshields, perfectly functioning engines. Combat vehicles actually looked like they'd been through a blender. Dents, scratches, patched bullet holes, jury-rigged repairs using whatever materials soldiers could scavenge. One veteran described his Jeep as held together with wire prayers and pure stubbornness. Aircraft maintenance presents another area where Hollywood misses the mark entirely. Movies show pilots jumping into their planes and taking off immediately. Real aircraft required extensive pre-flight checks, especially after combat missions. Mechanics examined every system, looking for battle damage, mechanical wear, and potential failures. Ground crews often worked through the night preparing planes for the next day's missions. Weather played havoc with military vehicles too, but films rarely acknowledge this challenge. Tanks got stuck in mud, so thick that entire units became sitting targets. Aircraft couldn't fly in heavy fog or severe storms, grounding air support when ground troops needed it most. Jeeps slid off icy mountain roads. Trucks broke through thin ice on frozen rivers. Mother Nature didn't care about military schedules. The most ridiculous vehicle myth involves those perfectly timed explosions when tanks get hit. Hollywood tanks explode like fireworks factories, shooting flames hundreds of feet into the air. Real tank brew-ups, as crews called them, were more like intense fires than spectacular explosions. Dangerous and deadly, absolutely, but not the Michael Bay extravaganzas you see in theaters. Aircraft dogfights suffer from similar dramatic exaggeration. Movies show pilots performing impossible maneuvers, aircraft absorbing dozens of hits before going down, and mid-air explosions that light up the sky. Real air combat was brief, violent, and often over before pilots fully understood what happened. Most kills resulted from mechanical failures or pilot error, rather than extended aerial duels. Supply lines for vehicles and aircraft created constant headaches that films completely ignore. Keeping tanks fueled, planes maintained, and spare parts available required massive logistical operations. Many vehicles sat unused not because they were destroyed, but because essential parts or fuel couldn't reach the front lines. The truth about World War II vehicles reveals a war fought with imperfect machines operated by people doing their best under impossible conditions. But that's just machinery and metal. The real story gets even more complex when you examine how Hollywood portrays the actual people fighting this war, especially those labeled as enemies. Hollywood loves painting World War II enemies as cartoon villains. Nazis always appear as brilliant masterminds with perfect plans, while Japanese soldiers get portrayed as faceless killing machines. But here's what really happened. The enemy forces were just as human, confused and flawed as everyone else. The Nazi propaganda machine worked overtime to create an image of unstoppable efficiency. Movies bought into this lie completely. Films show German officers as cold, calculating geniuses who never made mistakes. Reality: German commanders argued constantly among themselves. They made terrible decisions that cost them battles. At Stalingrad, Hitler refused to let his troops retreat even when generals begged him. That stubbornness killed an entire army. Then there's the myth of German technological superiority. Movies showcase their wonder weapons like they were unstoppable death machines. The truth is messier. Most German tanks broke down more often than they worked. Their famous Tiger tanks were so heavy they got stuck in mud constantly. During the Battle of Kursk, more German tanks failed mechanically than got destroyed by enemy fire. Makes you wonder why Hollywood never shows that. Japanese soldiers face even worse treatment in films. They're usually depicted as mindless fanatics who only knew how to charge and die. This racist portrayal ignores a crucial fact. Most Japanese soldiers were drafted peasants who didn't want to be there either. They had families back home, wrote letters about missing their children, and complained about bad food just like American GIs. War diaries captured after battles reveal Japanese soldiers were often terrified and homesick. But why does Hollywood stick to these stereotypes? Simple. It's easier to root for the good guys when the bad guys seem inhuman. Making enemies relatable complicates the story. Audiences don't want to think about enemy soldiers as scared 19-year-olds missing their mothers. Let's not forget how propaganda shaped these images during the actual war. American newspapers and posters deliberately made enemies look monstrous to boost morale at home. Hollywood just recycled these wartime images decades later. The problem is, we now know better. Captured German and Japanese documents show their soldiers dealt with the same problems as Allied forces: equipment failures, supply shortages, and incompetent officers. German soldiers weren't all hardcore Nazis either. Many were conscripts from occupied countries who got forced into service. Ukrainian, Polish, and French men ended up wearing German uniforms because they had no choice. Some German units had soldiers who spoke broken German and secretly hoped their side would lose. Movies never mention this inconvenient truth. And the weird part is how films handle German military competence. They swing between two extremes. Either Germans are unstoppable super soldiers or bumbling fools. Neither version is accurate. German forces had some excellent units and some terrible ones, just like every other army. Their early successes came from better tactics and equipment, not genetic superiority. When other countries caught up, German advantages disappeared quickly. Japanese military culture gets similarly distorted treatment. Yes, some units fought to the death rather than surrender, but this wasn't because they were naturally suicidal. Japanese military training emphasized shame over capture so intensely that many soldiers genuinely feared going home as prisoners more than dying. That's not fanaticism. That's social conditioning taken to a deadly extreme. Well, here's something movies almost never show: enemy soldiers helping civilians. German medics treated wounded Allied prisoners. Japanese soldiers sometimes shared food with starving local populations. These acts of humanity happened regularly, but don't fit the Hollywood villain narrative. Why complicate a perfectly good story with moral ambiguity? Intelligence reports from the war reveal another shocking truth. Enemy morale collapsed frequently. German units surrendered in massive numbers during the final months. Japanese garrisons on isolated islands often spent more time fighting starvation than Americans. But movies prefer showing enemies as relentlessly determined until the very end. The reality gets even more complicated when you look at individual relationships. American and German soldiers sometimes talked during unofficial truces. They traded cigarettes and photos of their families. One famous incident during the Battle of the Bulge saw both sides sharing a farmhouse on Christmas Eve. Try finding that story in a Hollywood blockbuster. Then there's the issue of war crimes, which films handle very selectively. They'll show Nazi atrocities but ignore similar acts by Japanese units, or mention Japanese brutality while skipping over some Allied mistakes. This cherry-picking creates a distorted view where some enemies seem more evil than others, when the truth is that war brought out the worst in people on all sides. The most important point: most enemy soldiers were conscripts who got caught up in their government's ambitions. They weren't born evil, they were ordinary people making terrible choices under extraordinary pressure. Understanding this doesn't excuse their actions, but it makes the whole conflict more human and tragically realistic. Speaking of human elements that movies miss, let's examine another Hollywood favorite that rarely matches reality: the world of spies and espionage during the war. Movies love their spy heroes. James Bond sliding down hotel walls, Ethan Hunt hanging from helicopters, and countless World War II films showing agents who can crack any code, seduce any enemy, and escape from impossible situations. Hollywood spies are basically superheroes with better suits. Real wartime espionage. Way less glamorous, like disappointingly less glamorous. Most spies spent their days hunched over radios, listening to static and trying to decode messages that might just be grocery lists. The exciting gadgets, mostly fantasy. A real spy's toolkit included a pencil, some paper, maybe a basic radio if they were lucky, and an incredible ability to blend into crowds without anyone noticing them. Take the famous British Special Operations Executive, or SOE. These agents parachuted into occupied Europe with one main job: cause trouble for the Nazis without getting caught. Sounds thrilling, right? Well, they mostly blew up railway lines at night, passed along information about troop movements, and tried really hard not to look suspicious while buying bread. The fear was constant and crushing. Unlike movie spies who crack jokes while defusing bombs, real agents lived in terror of making one tiny mistake. Wear the wrong shoes, dead. Use an outdated password, dead. Look nervous when a German patrol walks by, very, very dead. Then there's the code-breaking side of espionage, which Hollywood either ignores completely or makes look like some kind of mathematical magic show. The real code breakers at places like Bletchley Park were mostly women doing repetitive, mind-numbing work. They'd analyze thousands of intercepted messages, looking for patterns that might reveal enemy plans. No dramatic music, no last-second revelations, just hours and hours of careful, precise work that could save thousands of lives if done correctly. Intelligence mistakes happened all the time too. The Allies completely missed major German offensives. German spies got fooled by fake Allied plans. Japanese intelligence failed to predict American moves. Everyone was basically playing an incredibly deadly guessing game where wrong answers got people killed. Double agents added another layer of confusion. Some spies worked for both sides, feeding information back and forth while trying to remember which lies they'd told to whom. The pressure was incredible. One British double agent reportedly had a nervous breakdown because he couldn't keep track of all his different fake identities and cover stories. Communication was painfully slow and unreliable. Movie spies call headquarters from anywhere and get instant responses. Real spies might wait weeks for instructions, hiding radio equipment and hoping their messages actually reached the right people. Radio signals got jammed, intercepted, or just lost in the static. Many agents operated completely alone for months, making life or death decisions without any guidance from their handlers. The famous spy gadgets that movies love so much. Most didn't exist. No exploding pens, no cars with ejector seats, definitely no watches that could cut through steel. Real spies used whatever they could find locally. They made bombs from fertilizer and alarm clocks. They hid messages in hollow coins or inside book bindings. The most advanced piece of technology many agents carried was a suicide pill which tells you everything about their expected survival rates. Women played huge roles in real espionage networks, but their stories rarely make it to the big screen. Female agents could often move around more freely than men, because they seemed less threatening to occupying forces. They worked as couriers, safe house operators, and radio operators. Many were caught, tortured, and executed without ever getting the recognition they deserved. Resistance networks were incredibly fragile. One captured agent could bring down entire spy rings if they talked under interrogation. Everyone knew this, which created an atmosphere of constant paranoia. Agents used code names, avoided learning too much about their fellow spies, and always had escape plans ready. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. The information gathered by real spies was often mundane but crucial. They counted trains, noted which factories were producing what, tracked troop movements, and reported on civilian morale. This everyday intelligence helped military planners make better decisions, even though it lacked the drama of stolen battle plans or secret weapons. Intelligence work required patience above all else. Agents might spend months establishing their cover identities before they could start gathering useful information. They learned local customs, practiced regional accents, and memorized every detail of their fake backgrounds. One wrong answer to a casual question could expose years of careful preparation. But here's what makes the spy story even more complicated. While Hollywood focuses on secret agents and covert operations, some of the war's biggest intelligence successes happened in plain sight. Which brings us to something movies consistently get wrong about combat itself. After discussing the complex world of espionage, let's shift our focus skyward to one of World War II's most romanticized aspects, aerial combat. Hollywood absolutely loves its fighter pilots. Top Gun may be about jets, but the obsession with ace pilots started with WWII movies. Films make it seem like every mission involved spectacular dogfights with pilots pulling impossible maneuvers while delivering witty one-liners. The reality: most pilots never fired a single shot in anger. Here's what movies won't tell you: the vast majority of air missions were routine transport flights, reconnaissance runs, or bombing missions where fighters provided escort duty. Boring stuff, no dramatic barrel rolls or death-defying stunts. Just hours of flying in formation, watching for enemy aircraft that rarely appeared. Many pilots completed entire tours of duty without engaging in a single dogfight. When aerial combat did happen, it was nothing like the choreographed ballet you see on screen. Real dogfights lasted seconds, not minutes. Pilots had maybe one or two chances to line up a shot before planes scattered in different directions. The famous aces who shot down multiple enemy aircraft were statistical anomalies. For every ace pilot there were hundreds of regular pilots doing unglamorous work. Then there's the mechanical failure problem that Hollywood conveniently ignores. Planes crashed from engine trouble, fuel system failures, and mechanical breakdowns far more often than from enemy fire. Weather killed more pilots than bullets did. Flying in bad weather with primitive navigation equipment was essentially a death sentence. Many planes simply disappeared, never to be found. Movies love showing bombers flying in perfect formation while fighter escorts dance around them like protective angels. Real bomber missions were terrifying experiences where survival depended more on luck than skill. Anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with deadly flak that could shred a plane in seconds. German fighters would tear through bomber formations, and there wasn't much the escort fighters could do about it. The survival statistics tell the real story. In some bomber units, the average life expectancy was measured in missions, not months. The famous 8th Air Force lost over 26,000 men during the war. That's not a number you'll hear quoted in Hollywood's heroic aviation epics. Let's talk about those dramatic crash landings you see in movies. Pilots don't walk away from burning wrecks with just a scratch on their cheek. Real crash landings usually meant death or serious injury. Parachuting from a damaged aircraft wasn't a guaranteed escape either. Many pilots died when their parachutes failed, or when they landed in enemy territory. Hollywood also gets the technology completely wrong. Those sleek fighter planes in movies. Most real combat aircraft were patched together with spare parts and held together with hope. Mechanics worked miracles keeping planes airworthy, but mechanical reliability was always questionable. Guns jammed constantly. Radio equipment failed at crucial moments. Navigation instruments gave false readings. The famous aircraft you see in movies often weren't available when the films claim they were. Studios regularly use planes from later in the war to represent early war aircraft, or they'll show experimental aircraft that never saw actual combat. It's like watching a movie about the Civil War where everyone has automatic rifles. Fighter pilot training was rushed and inadequate, especially later in the war. German pilots by 1944 were getting sent into combat with minimal flight time. American pilots received better training, but even they were often thrown into combat situations they weren't prepared for. The learning curve was steep, and many didn't survive it. Movies show pilots as cool, confident heroes who never break under pressure. Real combat pilots suffered from what we now recognize as PTSD at alarming rates. They called it operational fatigue or flying stress, but the symptoms were the same: shaking hands, inability to sleep, panic attacks during missions. Many pilots were quietly grounded when they couldn't handle the psychological pressure. And here's something movies never show. Most air battles were one-sided massacres rather than evenly matched contests. When experienced pilots encountered green rookies, the outcome was predictable and ugly. Late in the war, German pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience were shooting down Allied pilots who'd barely learned to fly in formation. The famous squadron camaraderie you see in films, that was real, but it came with a dark side. Pilots had to watch their friends die regularly and then pretend everything was normal at dinner. The psychological toll of losing squadron mates mission after mission broke many men who never showed it outwardly. What makes this even more interesting is how these aviation myths shaped post-war culture and military thinking. The romanticized version of aerial combat influenced everything from recruitment to aircraft design philosophy. But if Hollywood got aviation wrong, wait until you see how they completely misunderstood the nature of heroism itself during wartime. You know what Hollywood loves most about war: the dramatic last stand. The brave soldier who throws himself on a grenade to save his buddies. The pilot who crashes his damaged plane into an enemy ship rather than bail out. These moments make for incredible cinema, but they paint a picture of World War II heroism that's miles away from reality. Real soldiers weren't walking around looking for opportunities to die gloriously. They were trying their best to stay alive and get home to their families. Makes sense, right? Yet movies keep showing us these noble sacrifices as if every battlefield was packed with guys competing for the most dramatic death. The truth is, most soldiers did everything they could to avoid unnecessary danger. They weren't cowards. They were smart. Survival meant being careful, following orders, and watching out for each other. But staying alive doesn't make for exciting movie scenes. Let's talk about those famous grenade scenes. You've seen them a dozen times. Enemy grenade lands in the foxhole, hero jumps on it, saves everyone else. Well, experienced soldiers knew better tricks. They'd kick grenades away if possible, or dive for cover in different directions. Jumping on a grenade was usually a last resort when no other option existed, not the first choice of some glory-seeking hero. And the weird part is how movies make these sacrifices look so clean and purposeful. Real wartime decisions happened in split seconds, often in chaos and confusion. Many acts of heroism were accidents or reflexes, not carefully planned noble gestures. Then there's the whole Medal of Honor myth. Hollywood suggests these medals were handed out primarily for dramatic last stands and heroic deaths. Actually, many recipients survived their actions and received medals for things like repeatedly running through enemy fire to rescue wounded soldiers, or single-handedly holding a position for hours. Plenty of medals went to medics, engineers, and support troops who never fired a shot in anger. The military understood something movies don't. Dead heroes can't fight tomorrow's battles. Commanders wanted soldiers who could complete missions and live to fight again, not martyrs looking for their moment of glory. Training emphasized tactics that kept people alive while achieving objectives. Real combat veterans often get annoyed watching these heroic sacrifice scenes because they know how rare such moments actually were. Most soldiers spent their time trying to figure out how to do their jobs without getting killed. They developed clever ways to stay safe while still being effective fighters. Consider the famous going down with the ship tradition. Movies love showing captains and officers nobly choosing to die with their vessels. In reality, naval regulations actually required officers to survive if possible, because experienced leaders were too valuable to lose. The Navy needed these men to command other ships and train new crews. But why does Hollywood keep pushing this narrative? Simple audiences eat it up. We want to believe in pure, selfless heroism. We want our wars to have clear moral moments where good triumphs through sacrifice. The messier reality of scared young men trying to survive doesn't sell as many tickets. Most genuine acts of heroism were much quieter than movies suggest. A soldier sharing his rations with a sick buddy. Someone volunteering for a dangerous patrol because he had the best navigation skills, not because he wanted to die gloriously. These everyday acts of courage kept units functioning and saved more lives than dramatic sacrifices ever could. Let's not forget the soldiers who openly admitted they were terrified and just wanted to go home. Military censors often removed these honest admissions from letters and diaries published during the war, but they survived in personal collections. Turns out, acknowledging fear didn't make someone less heroic, it made them human. The pressure to appear heroic actually caused problems for real soldiers. Some felt guilty for not living up to the movie version of military service. They wondered if their desire to survive made them selfish or cowardly. Veterans organizations spent decades after the war helping men understand that wanting to live didn't diminish their service. Even the famous last stands that did happen weren't usually planned heroic moments. They were often tactical necessities. Someone had to hold a position while others retreated, or a damaged plane couldn't make it back to base anyway. The heroism was real, but it came from doing necessary jobs under terrible circumstances, not from seeking glorious death. Military historians have studied thousands of combat reports and found that successful units were those that maximized survival while completing missions. The most effective soldiers were often the ones who came home, not the ones who died dramatically. They learned from experience, taught new recruits, and became the backbone of veteran units that could handle complex operations. Real heroism was usually about endurance, not explosion. Soldiers who fought through multiple campaigns, who kept going despite exhaustion and fear, who looked after their buddies day after day, these were the true heroes, even if their stories don't make for exciting movie scenes. Speaking of those buddies, and looking after each other, Hollywood has some pretty strange ideas about how women actually served in this war. When most people think about women in World War II movies, they picture Rosie the Riveter flexing her muscles, or maybe a glamorous spy sneaking through enemy lines. Hollywood loves showing women right in the thick of combat, guns blazing, saving the day alongside the boys. Well, here's the thing, that's not quite how it happened. The reality, women absolutely served their country during the war, but not the way movies make it look. Most weren't dodging bullets on the front lines or engaging in dramatic shootouts with Nazi soldiers. Instead, they were doing the unglamorous but absolutely vital work that kept the entire war machine running. And honestly, without them, the Allies would have been toast. Let's talk numbers for a second. Over 350,000 American women served in the military during World War II. Sounds impressive, right? But here's what Hollywood won't tell you. The vast majority worked as nurses, clerks, telephone operators and mechanics. They fixed planes, drove trucks, operated radios, and handled mountains of paperwork that kept armies organized. Not exactly the stuff of blockbuster action sequences, but absolutely essential. The Women's Army Corps, or WWII, employed about 150,000 women throughout the war. These weren't combat soldiers. They were doing jobs that freed up men to fight. Makes sense when you think about it. Why have a guy sitting behind a desk when he could be carrying a rifle? The women were often better at the administrative work anyway, though military brass would never admit that publicly back then. Then there's the Navy WAVES program. Women accepted for volunteer emergency service. Yeah, that's what WAVES stood for. About 100,000 women served in this program, and they were doing everything from weather forecasting to code breaking. Some of the most crucial intelligence work of the war was done by women sitting at desks, not by glamorous spies jumping off buildings. But wait, it gets more interesting. The real action was happening on the home front, where millions of women took over factory jobs. 6 million women entered the workforce during the war, building ships, planes, tanks and ammunition. These Rosie the Riveters were literally manufacturing victory, one rivet at a time. The famous B-17 Flying Fortress. Women built huge portions of those planes, the Sherman tanks rolling across Europe. Women's hands assembled those too. Hollywood rarely shows the discrimination these women faced though. Military women weren't allowed in combat zones. That was strictly off limits. They couldn't command men, couldn't make strategic decisions, and were often treated like second-class soldiers by their male counterparts. The few women who did get close to fighting usually worked as nurses in field hospitals, and even then they were kept as far from actual combat as possible. Here's where it gets really interesting. The Soviet Union. While American women stayed out of combat, Soviet women actually did fight on the front lines. About 800,000 Soviet women served in combat roles, including snipers, tank crews and pilots. The famous Soviet sniper Lyudmila Pavlyuchenko killed over 300 German soldiers, but American movies almost never tell these stories, probably because they complicate the narrative about women's roles in the war. American military leaders were terrified of putting women in danger. They worried about public reaction if female soldiers came home in body bags. The few American women who got close to combat zones were usually there by accident, nurses whose hospitals got overrun, or support staff caught in unexpected battles. When it happened, military brass rushed to get them out as quickly as possible. The discrimination went beyond just combat roles. Women in the military earned less money than men doing identical jobs. They faced constant suspicion about their moral character. Rumors flew constantly about female soldiers and their relationships with male colleagues. Many women left the service not because they couldn't handle the work, but because they got tired of defending their reputations. What's really wild is how quickly everything changed after the war ended. All those women who'd been building planes and fixing trucks, most got pushed right back into traditional roles as wives and mothers. The temporary wartime jobs disappeared, and society expected women to go back to cooking and cleaning. Some did, but many had gotten a taste of independence and weren't willing to give it up so easily. The women who served as military nurses probably had the most dangerous non-combat jobs of the war. They worked in field hospitals just behind the front lines, treating wounded soldiers under terrible conditions. No fancy medical equipment, limited supplies and the constant threat of enemy attacks. These women saved thousands of lives, but rarely get the Hollywood treatment because their heroism happened in hospital tents, not on battlefields. So when movies show women warriors charging into battle, remember the real story. The women of World War II served their country with incredible courage and skill, just not the way Hollywood imagines. Their contributions were less flashy but absolutely essential to victory. Speaking of Hollywood getting things wrong, let's examine how movies portray life on the home front. Movies love showing families gathered around radios, hearing about victories and cheering together. They skip the part where those same families were counting ration stamps and wondering if they had enough sugar for the week. The home front wasn't just about patriotic speeches and victory gardens looking perfect in suburban yards. Real families faced shortages that made daily life a puzzle. Gasoline was rationed, which meant you couldn't just drive wherever you wanted. People got stickers for their car windshields, A, B or C, that determined how much gas they could buy. An A sticker meant you were basically stuck driving to work and back. No weekend trips to visit grandma unless you wanted to walk. Then there's the food situation that Hollywood glosses over completely. Meat was rationed, sugar was rationed, coffee was rationed. Butter practically disappeared from store shelves. Families had ration books filled with tiny stamps, and when you ran out, you were done until next month. Housewives became expert traders, swapping stamps with neighbors like they were dealing cards. But wait. It gets more complicated. Blackouts weren't just dramatic movie moments with air raid sirens wailing. Cities practiced them regularly, and air raid wardens actually walked the streets, checking for light leaks. These weren't paid professionals. They were your neighbor Bob or Mrs. Johnson from down the block, wearing armbands and taking their volunteer job seriously. They'd knock on your door if they saw even a sliver of light coming through your curtains. Kids had completely different childhoods than movies typically show. Sure, they collected scrap metal and saved tin cans, but they also took on adult responsibilities. 12-year-olds worked in family businesses when dad was overseas. They helped mom manage ration stamps and learned to cook simple meals. Playtime involved making toy guns from wood scraps because real toy manufacturers were busy making actual weapons. The weird part is how information traveled back then. No internet, no cable TV, no instant news updates. Families crowded around radios for news broadcasts, but those broadcasts were heavily censored. The government didn't want to panic people, so bad news got sugar-coated or delayed. Families might not know their son's unit was in a major battle until weeks later. Factory work completely changed who was working where. Women took over jobs that men had always done, but movies usually focus on the glamorous Rosie the Riveter image. Real factory work was dangerous, exhausting, and dirty. Women worked long shifts making ammunition, building planes, and welding ship parts. Their hands got cut up, their backs ached, and they went home to take care of kids and manage households alone. Housing became a massive problem that films rarely mention. Military families moved constantly, following husbands and fathers to different bases. They lived in tiny apartments, shared rooms with strangers, or stayed in crowded boarding houses. Privacy disappeared when housing was scarce and expensive. Let's not forget the emotional toll that Hollywood sanitizes. Mothers and wives lived with constant worry, checking mailboxes for letters that might contain terrible news. The famous telegram delivery scenes in movies, those happened to real families every day. Western Union messengers became symbols of dread in neighborhoods across America. Entertainment changed too, but not always in inspiring ways. Hollywood movies during the war were full of propaganda, making everything seem cleaner and more heroic than reality. Radio shows pushed patriotic themes, even comic books turned into recruitment tools. Families wanted to escape the stress, but everything reminded them of the war. Money got tight for most families, despite what movies suggest about wartime prosperity. Military pay was low, and families stretched every dollar. Victory bonds weren't just patriotic gestures, they were investments that families hoped would pay off later. Many people bought them instead of spending money on things they needed immediately. Churches became community centers where people shared resources and information, not because of religious inspiration like in films, but because they needed practical help. Congregations organized carpools to save gas, shared recipes that worked with rationed ingredients, and passed along news about local boys serving overseas. The mail system became the lifeline that connected families to their soldiers. People wrote letters constantly, but mail took weeks to cross oceans. Families lived in delayed conversations, responding to news that was already old by the time they received it. Sometimes they got several letters at once, then nothing for months. Transportation systems strained under wartime demands. Trains carried troops and military supplies first, so civilian travel became unpredictable. Buses broke down more often because replacement parts were scarce. People walked more, biked more, and stayed home more than they wanted to. While families on the home front dealt with these daily realities, soldiers overseas faced their own medical challenges that movies tend to romanticize completely. Watching war movies, you'd think battlefield injuries were either a scratch that heroes shake off or instant death with dramatic speeches. The reality of World War II medicine tells a completely different story, one that Hollywood rarely wants to show because it's messy, slow, and often heartbreaking in ways that don't fit neat plot lines. Take a simple bullet wound to the leg. In movies, the tough guy ties a bandana around it and keeps fighting. Real soldiers with similar wounds, they faced weeks of agony, assuming they survived the infection that would almost certainly follow. Antibiotics were brand new technology. Penicillin had only been discovered in 1928, and mass production didn't start until 1942. Even then, supplies were so limited that military doctors had to choose which patients got the life-saving drug. Most wounded soldiers never saw penicillin at all. They got sulfur powder sprinkled on their wounds and prayers. Lots of prayers. Infections that we'd cure with a simple antibiotic today killed thousands of young men who survived the initial battle. A small shrapnel cut could turn deadly within days. Gangrene, tetanus, and blood poisoning were constant threats lurking in every wound. Field hospitals in movies looked like organized medical centers with clean beds and plenty of supplies. The real ones were often just tents set up miles behind the front lines. Sometimes they were barns, abandoned buildings, or whatever shelter medics could find. Doctors operated by flashlight when the generators failed. They ran out of morphine, bandages, and blood plasma regularly. Then there's the transportation problem that films conveniently skip. Getting wounded soldiers from the battlefield to medical help took hours, sometimes days. Medics had to crawl through gunfire to reach the injured, then carry them back on stretchers through mud, snow, or jungle terrain. Many soldiers died not from their wounds, but from the rough journey to get help. Jeeps bouncing over bombed roads weren't exactly smooth ambulance rides. Blood transfusions were still experimental medicine. Doctors didn't fully understand blood types yet, and mistakes killed patients who might have otherwise survived. Plasma was safer but often unavailable. Soldiers frequently died from blood loss that modern emergency rooms could handle easily. The whole concept of trauma medicine was being invented as the war progressed. Surgery happened without proper anesthesia more often than anyone wants to admit. When morphine ran out, doctors operated on conscious patients who bit down on leather straps. Some soldiers preferred to stay awake anyway, terrified they'd never wake up if they went under. Can you blame them? Medical technology that seems basic today was cutting-edge experimental stuff back then. Burns were particularly horrific because treatment options were so limited. Pilots who survived plane crashes often faced months of primitive skin grafts and experimental procedures. Many burned soldiers spent years in hospitals, undergoing dozens of painful operations. The lucky ones eventually looked somewhat normal again. Others lived with severe disfigurement for the rest of their lives, hidden away from a society that wasn't ready to see the true cost of war. Mental injuries got even less attention than physical ones. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was barely recognized as a real medical condition. Soldiers showing psychological symptoms were often labeled cowards or malingerers. Treatment consisted of being told to toughen up and get back to fighting. Some were actually court-martialed for what we now understand as severe trauma responses. The weird part is how many medical advances came from desperate battlefield conditions. Doctors learned to operate faster, manage massive casualties, and improvise with limited supplies. Techniques developed in bombed-out field hospitals later revolutionized civilian medicine. But the human cost of that education was enormous. Every breakthrough was paid for with the suffering of soldiers who became unwilling test cases. Recovery times were measured in months, not the movie version of dramatic overnight healing. A broken leg meant months in a cast with no physical therapy. Soldiers lost muscle mass, developed complications, and many never regained full mobility. The idea of rehabilitation medicine barely existed. You healed or you didn't. Simple as that. Military hospitals filled with young men missing limbs, scarred by burns or slowly dying from infections that today's medicine could cure with a simple prescription. Prosthetic limbs were crude contraptions that barely worked. Many amputees spent the rest of their lives struggling with primitive artificial limbs or wheelchairs. But here's what's really striking about the medical reality of World War II. It wasn't just about the dramatic battlefield injuries that movies focus on. The bigger killer was often basic disease and poor sanitation. Dysentery, typhus, and malaria claimed more soldiers than German bullets in many theaters of war. Speaking of overlooked realities, the chain of command that made all these life and death medical decisions was far more complex than Hollywood suggests. Hollywood loves showing military commanders as brilliant strategists who make split-second decisions that change everything. One general studies a map for 30 seconds, points dramatically, and declares, "We attack at dawn," then boom, victory follows like magic. The reality: military command during World War II was messy, slow, and filled with second-guessing that would make your most indecisive friend look confident. Real commanders didn't operate like chess masters moving pieces around a board. They dealt with broken radios, conflicting intelligence reports, and orders from higher-ups that sometimes made zero sense. General Patton might look decisive in films, but even he had to wait for fuel shipments, worry about supply lines, and argue with politicians back home about strategy. Makes sense, right? The famous D-Day invasion took over 2 years of planning. 2 years. Movies compress this into a few dramatic meetings, where Eisenhower stares at weather maps and makes the call. But the real planning involved thousands of people arguing about everything from boat designs to sandwich rations. Committees formed committees to study other committees' recommendations. One British officer complained that they held more meetings about the invasion than actual battles. Then there's the communication problem that films conveniently ignore. Radio technology in the 1940s was about as reliable as your grandfather's first television. Static, dead zones, and equipment failures meant commanders often had no idea what was happening 20 miles away. They'd send orders to units that had already moved, retreated, or been wiped out hours earlier. Some generals learned about major developments from newspaper reporters before their own intelligence officers told them. But here's where it gets really interesting. Many famous command decisions weren't made by the famous commanders at all. Staff officers, junior lieutenants, and even sergeants in the field made crucial choices that generals later got credit for. The Battle of the Bulge, Patton's dramatic pivot to help surrounded troops at Bastogne, looks brilliant in movies. Reality check: his staff had already been planning contingencies for weeks, and the actual turning movement involved dozens of colonels making independent decisions without waiting for orders from the top. Hollywood also skips the political nightmare that real commanders faced daily. Eisenhower spent more time managing egos and national rivalries than planning battles. British generals wanted glory for Britain. French resistance leaders demanded weapons and recognition. Soviet commanders operated under completely different rules and often refused to share basic information. American politicians back in Washington second-guessed every major decision and demanded impossible timelines. And the weird part is how many brilliant strategies were actually Plan B, C, or Z. The famous island-hopping campaign in the Pacific. MacArthur's original plans kept getting scrapped because of supply shortages, weather problems, and Japanese positions that intelligence had completely missed. Some of the most celebrated victories happened because commanders got lost, equipment broke down, or enemy forces moved to unexpected locations. Improvisation, not genius, won more battles than anyone wants to admit. Well, let's talk about the mistakes that movies pretend never happened. Operation Market Garden. The attempted capture of bridges in the Netherlands was sold as Montgomery's masterstroke. Complete disaster. Radios didn't work, maps were wrong, and intelligence reports about German tank positions were ignored. The operation failed spectacularly, but somehow film versions still make it look like a noble effort that almost succeeded through brilliant planning. Military historians love pointing out that successful World War II commanders were usually the ones who made fewer mistakes, not more brilliant moves. Rommel in North Africa looked like a tactical genius until his supply lines got stretched too thin and he ran out of fuel. German generals in Russia seemed unstoppable until winter hit, and their brilliant blitzkrieg tactics turned into frozen nightmares. The funniest gap between movies and reality might be how commanders actually spent their time. Films show them bent over maps, pointing at objectives, and giving inspiring speeches. Real commanders dealt with logistics, paperwork, supply requisitions, and personnel reports. One American general in Italy complained that he signed more forms than a tax accountant and spent most days arguing with quartermasters about toilet paper deliveries rather than planning attacks. Even famous last-minute saves that look so dramatic on screen usually took days or weeks to organize. Patton's relief of Bastogne required massive coordination between supply units, air support, and multiple army groups. The sudden decision to help happened after extensive staff work and preparation that movies never show, because watching officers argue about fuel supplies doesn't make for exciting cinema. This command chaos reveals something crucial that Hollywood consistently misses. But the real story of how these flawed, overwhelmed leaders managed to coordinate massive prisoner of war operations becomes even more fascinating when you realize just how unprepared most of them were for what came next. Hollywood loves a good prison break story. Steve McQueen bouncing a motorcycle over barbed wire in The Great Escape, dramatic tunnel digging scenes with prisoners sweating underground for months, guards constantly foiled by clever inmates who seem to have endless time and resources for elaborate schemes. The reality: most POW camps were boring as hell. Prisoners of war spent their days following strict routines that would make a monastery seem exciting. Wake up at dawn, stand for roll call that lasted hours, eat watery soup and stale bread, walk around the same small yard, sleep on wooden boards with threadbare blankets, repeat for months or years. But wait, what about all those famous escape stories we see in movies? Well, they happened. Sort of. The Great Escape actually took place, but here's the kicker: 76 men escaped through those famous tunnels, and 73 were recaptured within days. Most never made it more than a few miles from camp. The 3 who successfully reached freedom, they got lucky breaks that had nothing to do with clever planning. Then there's the hunger issue that films conveniently skip. POWs were always hungry. Not just I could go for a snack hungry, but genuine starvation that made men obsess over crumbs. Red Cross parcels became more valuable than gold when they actually arrived. Prisoners would save single raisins for special occasions and trade cigarettes for extra spoonfuls of thin gruel. Treatment varied wildly depending on which country ran your camp and what nationality you happened to be. American and British prisoners in German camps generally faced better conditions than Soviet prisoners, who often died from neglect and deliberate starvation. Japanese camps were notorious for brutal treatment of all Allied prisoners, with survival rates that would shock modern audiences. Movies show prisoners constantly plotting and scheming, but most spent their time trying to stay mentally intact. They organized classes, teaching each other languages or sharing professional skills. A captured accountant might teach mathematics while a former farmer explained crop rotation. Libraries appeared from donated books, and prisoners put on amateur theatrical performances with men playing all the female roles. Sports became huge. Prisoners organized elaborate tournaments with makeshift equipment, turning cardboard into ping-pong paddles and creating soccer balls from rags and string. These weren't just casual games. Men took them seriously as psychological lifelines that helped maintain sanity and physical fitness. Letter writing consumed enormous amounts of time and emotional energy. Prisoners could usually send 1 letter per month, so they'd spend weeks crafting each message, trying to reassure families back home while following strict censorship rules. They developed codes to communicate real conditions, hiding messages within innocent-sounding sentences about weather or imaginary mutual friends. The weird part is how prisoners adapted to camp hierarchies that had nothing to do with military rank. The guy who could repair shoes became incredibly important. Someone who spoke German fluently gained influence as an interpreter. Men who could organize entertainment or maintain morale often commanded more respect than actual officers. Escape attempts were far rarer and less successful than Hollywood suggests. Most prisoners realized early that the odds were terrible. Where would you go? How would you eat? What happens when locals spot an obvious foreigner who doesn't speak the language? Smart prisoners often focused on survival rather than dramatic breakout schemes. Guard relationships were more complex than films portray. Some German guards were elderly men or wounded veterans who had little enthusiasm for watching prisoners. Others were young fanatics who followed every rule brutally. Prisoners learned to read individual personalities and adjust accordingly. Certain guards might look the other way during minor rule violations, while others would report everything to camp commanders. Work details provided some variety but came with their own risks and opportunities. Prisoners might be assigned to local farms, factories, or construction projects. These jobs offered chances to interact with civilian populations, sometimes leading to small acts of kindness like extra food or smuggled news. But work also meant exposure to Allied bombing raids and potential accusations of collaboration. Religious services became crucial for many prisoners regardless of their previous faith levels. Chaplains, whether officially assigned or simply ordained prisoners, provided counseling and hope during the darkest moments. Men who had never been particularly religious often found comfort in organized prayer and community worship. Mental health challenges were constant and severe, though nobody called it PTSD back then. Prisoners developed elaborate fantasy lives, mentally designing dream houses or planning detailed post-war businesses. Some withdrew completely, while others became obsessively talkative. Camp leaders tried to identify and help men who were breaking down psychologically. Liberation brought its own complications that movies typically ignore. Many prisoners were so malnourished and institutionalized that freedom felt overwhelming and frightening. While prisoners dreamed of home, another group of people were fighting their own battles in occupied territories, using very different tactics for survival and resistance. When you mention the Holocaust in casual conversation, most people immediately think of famous movies like Schindler's List or The Pianist. These films show pieces of the truth, but they barely scratch the surface of what really happened. Hollywood has a problem with the Holocaust. It's either too scared to show the full horror, or it wraps everything up in neat dramatic packages that miss the massive scale of what occurred. The biggest myth movies perpetuate, that the Holocaust happened quickly, like some terrible storm that passed through Europe in a year or two. Wrong. This systematic murder took place over nearly a decade, starting with laws that stripped away basic rights in the 1930s and escalating into industrial-scale killing by the 1940s. Movies compress this timeline because audiences can't sit through years of gradual horror, but that compression makes people miss how methodical and planned everything was. Most films focus almost exclusively on Jewish victims, which makes sense given they comprised the largest group murdered. But the Holocaust targeted many others that rarely get screen time. Roma people, disabled individuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, political prisoners, and LGBTQ+ individuals all faced systematic extermination. Movies skip these groups because it complicates the narrative, but ignoring them erases millions of victims from public memory. Then there's the geography problem. Hollywood tends to focus on a handful of famous camps like Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen, creating the impression that the Holocaust happened in just a few locations. The reality, over 40,000 camps, ghettos and killing sites spread across Nazi-occupied territory. That number isn't a typo, move 40,000. The logistics alone boggle the mind, yet most people only know the names of 3 or 4 camps. Transportation scenes in movies usually show crowded cattle cars, which is accurate, but they miss the bureaucratic machinery that made it all possible. Deportations required train schedules, paperwork, local police cooperation, and administrative coordination across multiple countries. The paperwork still exists in archives, neat, orderly documents planning mass murder like they were organizing office supplies. That banality of evil doesn't make for exciting cinema, but it reveals how ordinary people became complicit in extraordinary crimes. Let's talk about resistance, because Hollywood gets this completely wrong. Movies love showing dramatic uprisings like the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt, which absolutely happened and deserves recognition, but they ignore thousands of smaller acts of resistance that kept people alive. Smuggling food into ghettos, hiding children with non-Jewish families, documenting what was happening through secret diaries and photographs. Teachers continuing to educate kids in hiding. These quiet acts of defiance saved more lives than dramatic shootouts, but they don't make for thrilling movie scenes. The liberation scenes in films really bug historians. Movies show Allied soldiers arriving at camps, looking shocked for about 30 seconds, then immediately beginning rescue operations. Real liberators described being physically sick, unable to process what they were seeing. Many soldiers had no idea what they would find. General Eisenhower was so disturbed that he ordered extensive documentation because he predicted people would someday deny it happened. Some liberators needed psychological treatment afterward, something movies completely ignore. Survival stories get Hollywood treatment too. Films suggest that surviving was about being brave, clever, or morally superior. Survivors themselves tell different stories. Luck played a huge role, being in the right place when selections happened, having skills the Nazis needed, getting help from unexpected people, random acts of kindness from guards having bad days. Survivors often struggle with guilt about living when others died, not triumph about their cleverness. Movies also create myths about who knew what when. Films suggest the full extent of the Holocaust was secret until liberation, but evidence shows many people knew terrible things were happening. Swiss banks were handling stolen gold. Locals living near camps could smell the smoke and see the ash. Soldiers wrote letters home mentioning mass killings. The secrecy wasn't about information. It was about people choosing not to look too closely at uncomfortable truths. The weird part about Holocaust movies is how they end. Most finish with liberation or courtroom justice, creating closure that didn't exist in real life. Survivors faced decades of health problems, poverty and trauma. Many countries refused to take refugees after the war. Some survivors discovered their property had been stolen, and their neighbors wouldn't return it. Others found their entire communities had been erased. Justice was slow, incomplete, and often politically motivated. But here's what really bothers historians about Hollywood's approach. It makes the Holocaust feel like ancient history instead of something that happened within living memory. Many survivors are still alive today. The bureaucrats who organized deportations lived normal lives after the war. Some worked for NASA or became respected citizens in their communities. Speaking of communities, resistance movements that helped Jews survive faced their own complicated realities that movies barely touch. While Hollywood loves showing glamorous resistance fighters conducting elaborate sabotage missions with perfect timing and flawless execution, the reality was far messier and much more dangerous. Most resistance work wasn't about dramatic explosions or daring raids. It was about ordinary people doing small, risky things that added up over time. Take the French resistance, which movies love to romanticize. The truth? These groups spent most of their time arguing with each other. Communists fought with Catholics. Gaullists clashed with other political factions. Everyone wanted to be in charge after the war ended. Some groups refused to work together, even when it meant missing opportunities to hurt the Germans. Politics mattered more than patriotism in many cases. Real resistance work was incredibly boring most of the time. Fighters would wait weeks for a single supply drop. They'd spend months printing underground newspapers that only a few dozen people would read. Many resistance members never fired a shot or blew up a single bridge. Their biggest contribution was hiding Jewish families or passing along information about German troop movements. Then there's the survival aspect movies completely ignore. Resistance fighters lived in constant terror of betrayal. Your neighbor could turn you in for extra food rations. Your best friend might be working for the Gestapo. Paranoia wasn't just healthy, it kept you alive. Most resistance cells had no idea what other cells were doing. They couldn't risk it. The weapons situation was laughably bad compared to Hollywood versions. Resistance fighters often had one old hunting rifle between 5 people. Ammunition was so scarce they'd save bullets for months before using them. Those dramatic scenes where fighters mow down German patrols with machine guns. Pure fantasy. Most resistance members never saw a machine gun, let alone used one effectively. Communication was another nightmare. While movies show resistance fighters with reliable radio networks and coded messages that always get through, reality was different. Radios broke constantly. Codes got mixed up. Messages took days or weeks to reach their destination. Many resistance operations failed because somebody misunderstood the plan or never got the message at all. But here's what really gets overlooked: the incredible courage of ordinary helpers. The baker who hid weapons in flour sacks. The school teacher who forged identity papers. The farmer's wife who fed escaped prisoners. These people weren't trained fighters. They were regular folks who risked everything to help strangers. Yet movies barely mention them because they're not exciting enough. The casualty rates tell the real story. In some regions, resistance fighters had a life expectancy of just 3 months. Getting caught meant torture, execution or deportation to concentration camps. Your family would suffer too. The Germans loved collective punishment. Arrest one resistance fighter, and they'd shoot 10 civilians from his village. Women played huge roles that Hollywood consistently underplays. They carried messages, hid weapons and ran safe houses. German soldiers were less suspicious of women, which made them perfect for dangerous missions. Marie-Madeleine Fourcade ran one of France's largest spy networks with over 3,000 agents. Most people have never heard of her, because she doesn't fit the Hollywood image of what resistance looked like. Intelligence work was probably the most important resistance activity, yet it's the least glamorous. No dramatic shootouts or car chases. Just careful observation and note-taking. Resistance members would count German trucks passing through town, sketch military installations, or report on troop morale. This information helped the Allies plan bombing raids and military operations. The timing of resistance activities was crucial, but movies get it wrong. Early in the war, resistance was extremely limited and often counterproductive. Germans would execute 50 civilians for every German killed. Smart resistance leaders waited until later in the war, when German control was weakening and Allied victory seemed possible. Escape networks were another unglamorous but vital part of resistance work. Moving Allied airmen from crash sites to neutral countries required hundreds of helpers along the route. Each person in the chain risked their life for a few hours of work. One betrayal could destroy an entire network that took years to build. Supply drops from Allied aircraft were hit-or-miss affairs. Literally, planes often missed their targets by miles. Supplies ended up in lakes, forests, or German hands. Sometimes resistance fighters would wait all night for a drop that never came. Other times they'd find weapons but no ammunition, or ammunition that didn't fit their weapons. The psychological toll was enormous. Living under false identities, never knowing who to trust, watching friends disappear, it drove many fighters to mental breakdown. Some resistance members cracked under pressure and revealed everything they knew. Others simply walked away and tried to disappear into civilian life. What's fascinating is how many resistance networks operated almost invisibly. Some groups saved thousands of lives without the Germans ever realizing they existed. Their success came from staying small, staying quiet, and avoiding the dramatic gestures that movies love so much. Understanding this reality makes the next topic even more compelling: how science and technology really shaped the war versus Hollywood's obsession with superweapons. When Hollywood shows World War II technology, they love the flashy stuff. Secret weapons, wonder gadgets, scientists in underground bunkers building death rays. But here's what they won't tell you: most of the war was fought with equipment that would make your grandfather laugh. Take the famous German V2 rocket. Movies make it sound like some game-changing superweapon that nearly won the war. Well, here's the reality check. These rockets were incredibly expensive to build, wildly inaccurate, and killed more people making them than they ever did as weapons. The slave laborers in the underground factories suffered more casualties than the civilians these rockets supposedly terrorized. Each V2 cost about as much as a fighter plane, but couldn't even hit the right city half the time. Then there's radar, which actually did change everything. But you won't see many movies about guys staring at green screens in dark rooms. Not exactly blockbuster material, right? British radar operators spotted incoming German planes hours before they arrived, giving the Royal Air Force time to scramble fighters. This boring technology probably saved Britain from invasion. Yet Hollywood prefers showing dramatic dogfights over the nerdy math that made those victories possible. Speaking of nerdy math, let's talk about those famous code breakers at Bletchley Park. Movies love showing brilliant mathematicians having sudden eureka moments, cracking impossible codes in minutes. The truth, breaking German codes took years of methodical work by hundreds of people. Most of them were women doing tedious calculations by hand, checking and double-checking each other's work. No dramatic music, no last-second breakthroughs, just smart people doing repetitive math problems for months on end. And the weird part is how movies handle medical advances. They'll show soldiers getting shot and walking it off like action heroes, but they completely miss the real medical revolution happening behind the scenes. Penicillin was so new and rare that doctors had to collect patients' urine to recycle the precious antibiotic. Blood transfusions were still experimental. Many wounded soldiers died from infections that any modern hospital could cure with a simple prescription. But why do films obsess over atomic bombs while ignoring simpler innovations that saved more lives? Portable X-ray machines helped field surgeons locate shrapnel. Improved anesthetics meant soldiers could survive complex operations. Plasma transfusions kept people alive long enough to reach proper hospitals. These weren't sexy science fiction gadgets, they were practical tools that actually worked when you needed them most. Let's not forget the famous computers everyone talks about. Well, computers were people, not machines. Rooms full of mathematicians, again, mostly women, calculating artillery trajectories and bombing patterns using mechanical calculators and slide rules. The first electronic computer, ENIAC, wasn't finished until after the war ended. All those crucial calculations that helped win battles were done by humans with pencils and paper. Then there is the whole myth about German engineering superiority. Hollywood loves showing perfect Nazi technology. Tanks that never break down, planes that always start, weapons that never jam. Reality was messier. German tanks were so over-engineered they constantly needed repairs. The famous Tiger tank was nearly impossible to maintain in combat conditions. Meanwhile, American Sherman tanks were simple, reliable, and easy to fix with basic tools. Japanese technology gets even weirder treatment in movies. Films either show them as technologically backwards or as evil geniuses with secret weapons. Truth is, Japan had some brilliant innovations, like their oxygen-fueled torpedoes that could travel much farther than American versions. But they also had pilots flying planes held together with bamboo and fabric because they'd run out of metal. Technology wasn't about good guys versus bad guys, it was about resources and industrial capacity. Makes sense, right? The side with more factories usually won. America wasn't necessarily smarter than Germany or Japan. They just had more steel mills, more oil refineries, and more assembly lines that enemy bombers couldn't reach. When German scientists invented jet engines, they couldn't mass produce them because Allied bombing had wrecked their manufacturing plants. Aircraft carriers provide another perfect example of Hollywood getting it backwards. Movies show these massive ships as unsinkable floating fortresses bristling with advanced technology. Real carriers were basically floating airfields with incredibly thin armor. One lucky bomb hit could turn the world's most expensive warship into a burning wreck. The USS Yorktown was sunk by a single submarine torpedo, despite all its supposed technological advantages. Communication technology was equally primitive by today's standards. Radio operators had to carry heavy, unreliable equipment that often failed at crucial moments. Messages were sent by Morse code, which required skilled operators who could tap out letters faster than most people can type. No instant communication, no satellite phones, just crackling voices over static-filled airwaves. So while movies focus on dramatic secret weapons and brilliant inventions, the real war was won by boring, reliable technology that actually worked under pressure. But that raises an interesting question about another piece of wartime mythology that Hollywood absolutely loves to get wrong. The biggest D-Day movie moments make it look like a perfectly choreographed operation. Soldiers storm the beach in organized waves. Officers bark clear commands. Everyone knows exactly where they're going. The reality: complete chaos from minute one. Most landing craft missed their targets by miles. Literally miles. The plan called for precise landings at specific beach sectors, but rough seas and strong currents threw everything off course. Soldiers found themselves dumped onto unfamiliar stretches of sand with no idea where they were supposed to be. Maps became useless when you couldn't figure out which part of the coastline you'd actually landed on. Hollywood loves showing those dramatic ramp drops where soldiers charge forward with determination. What actually happened was far more brutal. Many men drowned before taking a single step on French soil. The weight of their equipment pulled them straight to the bottom in deep water. Others got tangled in underwater obstacles the Germans had planted specifically to trap landing craft. Weather nearly cancelled the entire invasion. Eisenhower spent days agonizing over storm reports and wind predictions. The original date got pushed back because of terrible conditions that would have made landing impossible. Even on June 6, the weather wasn't good, just barely acceptable. Seasick soldiers had been stuck on transport ships for extra days, throwing up and feeling miserable before the real fight even started. German defenses were nastier than most films show. Those concrete bunkers weren't just sitting there looking menacing, they were packed with machine guns that had been pre-aimed at specific spots on the beach. German gunners had spent months calculating exactly where to shoot when Allied soldiers appeared. Some positions were nearly impossible to see from the beach, hidden behind clever camouflage and positioned to create deadly crossfires. The famous Omaha beach scene in movies always focuses on the courage and eventual breakthrough. Fair enough that courage was real, but the planning mistakes rarely get mentioned. Intelligence reports had missed several German units that weren't supposed to be there. The preliminary bombing, meant to soften up defenses, largely missed its targets due to cloud cover. Allied naval gunfire couldn't reach many of the most dangerous German positions because they were too well protected. Communication broke down everywhere. Radio equipment got soaked and stopped working. Officers couldn't coordinate with their units. Different landing groups had no idea what was happening a few hundred yards away. Some commanders spent hours thinking their entire sector was failing when other parts of the invasion were actually going okay. The famous story of paratroopers scattered all over Normandy wasn't just bad luck, it was typical of how much went wrong with the detailed plans. Tank support arrived later than expected, and many of those amphibious tanks sank before reaching shore. Engineers tasked with clearing obstacles worked under constant fire, making their jobs nearly impossible. Medics couldn't reach wounded soldiers pinned down on open sand. The timeline shown in movies, where progress happens steadily through the day, doesn't match witness accounts of hours-long stalemates and confusion. Yet somehow it worked. Not because everything went according to plan, but because enough things went right despite the massive problems. German commanders were caught off guard by the location and timing. Hitler was asleep and his staff was afraid to wake him with invasion news. Key German tank divisions were held back because officers thought D-Day might be a diversion for the real invasion elsewhere. The breakthrough came from individual initiative rather than grand strategy. Small groups of soldiers figured out how to attack specific bunkers. A few tanks finally made it up the beach. Engineers cleared enough obstacles to get more equipment through. Gradually, chaos started working in favor of the Allies instead of against them. Casualties were horrific, especially at Omaha Beach, but not quite as bad as the worst-case predictions. Military planners had secretly prepared for losses that could have reached 25,000 men or more. The actual numbers were terrible enough, over 4,000 Allied casualties on D-Day itself, but low enough to keep the invasion moving forward. What's remarkable isn't that everything went perfectly. Movies showing smooth operations miss the real story of ordinary soldiers adapting to disaster and somehow making progress anyway. Commanders making quick decisions with incomplete information. Engineers improvising solutions to problems they'd never trained for. Medics saving lives under impossible conditions. The clean movie version of D-Day sells the real participants short. Their actual accomplishment was messier, more desperate, and ultimately more impressive than any Hollywood script. They succeeded not because they were following a perfect plan, but because they kept going when plans fell apart. While D-Day grabbed headlines in the West, another front was grinding through battles that would make Normandy look small. The Eastern Front was swallowing entire armies. Hollywood loves showing American GIs storming beaches and British troops marching through Europe, but there's a massive chunk of World War II that barely gets screen time in Western movies. The Eastern Front, where the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany tore each other apart in the bloodiest conflict in human history. Most war films act like the Eastern Front was some sideshow. Wrong. This was where the real war happened. While Americans were dealing with thousands of casualties, the Soviets were counting their dead in millions. Not thousands, millions. The Red Army lost over 20 million people during the war. That's more than the entire population of many countries today. American and British losses combined don't even come close to that number. Yet Hollywood barely mentions it. When they do show Soviet soldiers, they're usually portrayed as either mindless zombies charging into machine gun fire, or brutal savages who drink vodka and shoot their own men. The reality was way more complicated. Soviet soldiers weren't superhuman killing machines, but they weren't cowards either. They were regular people fighting for their homeland against an enemy that wanted to wipe them off the map. Many fought with incredible bravery, others ran away when they could, just like soldiers everywhere. Then there's the scale of the battles. Movies love showing D-Day as this massive operation that lasted one dramatic day. Fair enough, it was important. But Eastern Front battles made D-Day look like a local skirmish. The Battle of Stalingrad lasted 5 months. 5 months of house-to-house fighting in a city that was being bombed into rubble while people were still living in it. The siege of Leningrad went on for almost 3 years. 3 years, people ate wallpaper paste and leather belts to survive. Over 1 million civilians died just from starvation and disease. Hollywood made one movie about it. One. But here's where it gets really twisted. Soviet soldiers often faced a nightmare choice that Western movies never show. Fight and maybe die from enemy bullets. Or retreat, and definitely get shot by your own side. The Soviet Union had blocking units behind the front lines, whose job was to shoot anyone running away. Talk about motivation through fear. This wasn't some rare occurrence either. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were executed by their own army for desertion, cowardice, or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The famous Order 227 basically said, not one step back, retreat meant death. No wonder Soviet casualty numbers were so high. The equipment situation was just as brutal. While Hollywood shows American soldiers complaining about their gear, Soviet troops were sharing rifles, literally sharing. Some units had one rifle for every 2 or 3 men. The idea was that when the guy with the gun got shot, the next guy would pick it up and keep fighting. Charming. Winter fighting was another nightmare that movies barely touch. Everyone knows about Napoleon and Hitler both getting beaten by Russian winter, but they don't show what that actually meant for the soldiers. Frostbite was so common that losing fingers and toes was just part of military life. Weapons wouldn't work in extreme cold. Vehicles broke down constantly. Soldiers burned furniture, books, anything they could find just to stay warm enough to survive another day. What's really crazy is how some of the biggest battles in human history happened on the Eastern Front, and most people in the West have never heard of them. The Battle of Kursk involved over 4 million soldiers and lasted weeks. It had more tanks fighting each other than any battle before or since. Hollywood's response: crickets. The weird part is that Soviet soldiers actually accomplished some pretty incredible things that would make great movie material. The defense of Stalingrad involved regular factory workers grabbing weapons and fighting alongside trained soldiers. Women served as snipers, tank crews and fighter pilots in numbers that would shock modern audiences. But Western films prefer to stick with the same old D-Day and Pacific Theater stories. Even the famous Soviet tactics get misrepresented. Yes, they sometimes used human wave attacks that resulted in massive casualties, but they also developed some of the most effective military strategies of the war. Their deep battle doctrine and combined arms tactics influenced military thinking for decades afterward. They weren't just throwing bodies at problems. The truth is, the Eastern Front decided World War II. Hitler lost the war when he invaded the Soviet Union, not when America entered the conflict. The majority of German divisions were fighting on the Eastern Front throughout most of the war. The Western Front was important, but it was never the main event. Understanding this massive conflict requires looking beyond Hollywood's narrow focus on Western Allied experiences. The scale of suffering and sacrifice on the Eastern Front was unlike anything else in human history. But recognizing that reality means confronting some uncomfortable truths about how different nations experienced and remembered the war. Speaking of uncomfortable truths, there's another side of World War II that movies tend to gloss over completely. Hollywood loves its soldiers, tanks rolling, planes diving, heroes charging into battle with perfect timing and flawless courage. What they don't show you much: the millions of regular people who got caught in the middle of this massive war without any choice in the matter. While movies focus on military action, World War II was really a civilians' war. More than half of all deaths weren't soldiers at all. They were regular folks trying to survive in their own neighborhoods when the war came crashing through their front doors. Take London during the Blitz. Films show dramatic scenes of people singing in subway stations, keeping their chins up with British resolve. Well, that happened sometimes. But mostly, people were terrified, exhausted, and angry about losing sleep every single night for months. Kids wet their beds from fear. Adults snapped at each other over tiny things because their nerves were shot. The singing was nice when it happened, but the constant smell of unwashed bodies packed underground wasn't exactly movie material. Then there were the food shortages that lasted for years. Hollywood might show one scene of rationing, maybe a character complaining about coffee or sugar. Reality hit harder than that. British families got 4 ounces of bacon per week if they were lucky. 4 ounces. That's barely enough for one decent breakfast. Kids grew up not knowing what chocolate tasted like. Mothers spent hours standing in lines just hoping stores might have potatoes left. The weird part is how normal this became. Children played war games in bombed-out buildings like it was the most natural playground in the world. They collected shrapnel like other kids collected baseball cards. Growing up during wartime meant learning to sleep through air raid sirens and knowing which buildings in your neighborhood were probably going to collapse next. Let's not forget the millions of people who got forced out of their homes. Refugees clogged roads across Europe with whatever they could carry. Families walked for weeks, sleeping in ditches, drinking from puddles, hoping to find somewhere safe. Movies show this sometimes, but usually just as background scenery for the real military action. Here's what gets really heartbreaking though. Families torn apart for years at a time. Fathers disappeared into military service. Mothers got separated from children during evacuations. Kids evacuated from London to the countryside, often lived with complete strangers for months or years. Some parents and children didn't recognize each other when the war finally ended. In occupied countries, civilians faced impossible choices every single day. Share your food with starving neighbors or save it for your own family. Report suspicious activity to authorities or pretend you didn't see anything. Help hide Jewish families and risk execution, or stay safe and live with guilt forever. These weren't dramatic movie moments. They were quiet, desperate decisions that ordinary people made while trying to survive. Soviet civilians had it particularly brutal. The siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days. People ate wallpaper paste, leather belts, anything that might have calories. Parents watched their children starve to death. Some resorted to cannibalism. Hollywood rarely touches stories this dark because they're too disturbing for entertainment. Japanese civilians experienced something similar but different. American bombing campaigns targeted cities full of regular people. The firebombing of Tokyo killed more civilians in one night than both atomic bombs combined. Families huddled in their wooden homes as walls of fire swept through entire neighborhoods. Makes sense why Japan's surrender came when it did. right? But here's what's really striking about civilian wartime experience. How people adapted and kept living. Kids still played games. Teenagers still fell in love. People still got married, had babies, celebrated birthdays, told jokes. Life found ways to continue even when everything seemed hopeless. Women especially carried enormous burdens that films barely acknowledge. They ran households without men, worked factory jobs, managed farms, raised children alone, and somehow kept communities functioning. Many became single mothers overnight, when husbands died in combat. Others never found out what happened to missing family members. And the children, they grew up fast. 10-year-olds learned to identify aircraft by sound. Teenagers took on adult responsibilities. Some kids spent their entire childhoods living in basements, bomb shelters, or refugee camps. Their playground games involved dodging real bullets and avoiding real landmines. The psychological damage lasted long after peace treaties got signed. Entire generations grew up with trauma that nobody really understood back then. What we now call PTSD affected civilians just as much as soldiers, but without recognition or treatment. War crimes happen to civilians too, but those stories often get sanitized or skipped entirely in Hollywood versions. Mass executions, forced labor, systematic rape, medical experiments. Regular people endured horrors that most films won't even hint at. This massive civilian suffering raises uncomfortable questions about how war really works. Wondrous questions that become even more complex when examining what happened after the fighting supposedly ended. Hollywood loves painting World War II in black and white, good guys versus bad guys, heroes fighting villains. The Allies always noble, the Axis always evil. But real war gets messy fast. War crimes happened on both sides, and justice afterward was anything but perfect. Most movies skip this uncomfortable truth entirely. They don't want to show American soldiers looting German homes or British troops shooting prisoners. Why would they? It ruins the clean narrative. But ignoring these facts means missing a huge piece of what actually happened during and after the war. Let's start with something Hollywood rarely touches. Allied soldiers committed crimes too. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough to matter. American troops sometimes shot German prisoners who were trying to surrender. British forces executed, captured SS officers without trials. Soviet soldiers, well, their crimes were massive and systematic, especially as they pushed into Germany. The numbers tell a different story than the movies. Soviet forces raped an estimated 2 million German women during their advance. American military courts tried over 5,000 soldiers for various crimes during the war. French resistance fighters often settled personal scores under the cover of fighting Nazis. These aren't comfortable facts, but they're facts nonetheless. War brings out the worst in people sometimes. Stress, fear, anger, and the chaos of combat created situations where normal moral rules broke down. A soldier who lost his best friend to a sniper might not feel generous toward captured enemies. Units that discovered concentration camps sometimes took immediate, brutal revenge. Then there's the looting problem. Movies show soldiers as disciplined heroes, but reality was messier. Jerry's shipped home Nazi daggers, medals, and artwork as souvenirs. Some took much more valuable items. Entire art collections disappeared from German museums and private homes. The line between war trophy and theft got blurry fast. Japanese-American internment camps represent another crime. Hollywood often glosses over 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent were imprisoned by their own government. No trial, no evidence of wrongdoing, just fear and racism wrapped in wartime security concerns. Most war movies ignore this completely, or mention it briefly before moving on to more heroic topics. But here's where it gets really interesting. After the war ended, what happened to justice? The Nuremberg trials get the spotlight in films, portrayed as swift, fair justice for Nazi war criminals. Reality was much more complicated and political. The trials took years, not months. Many major war criminals escaped completely. Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust, lived quietly in Argentina until 1960. Thousands of lower-level Nazis simply blended back into German society. Some even got jobs with Allied intelligence agencies because they had useful information about the Soviets. Meanwhile, Soviet war crimes were never prosecuted at all. Stalin's forces killed millions of civilians, but since the USSR was on the winning side, their crimes got swept under the diplomatic rug. The Allies needed Soviet cooperation for the post-war world, so uncomfortable questions about Soviet brutality were quietly dropped. Justice also depended on politics and nationality. German generals who committed crimes on the Eastern Front often received lighter sentences than those who fought in Western Europe. Japanese war criminals faced different treatment depending on whether they had scientific knowledge the Americans wanted for the Cold War. The weirdest part: some war criminals became valuable assets. Operation Paperclip brought Nazi scientists to America to work on rockets and weapons. Unit 731, Japan's horrific biological warfare unit, saw many of its members escape prosecution in exchange for sharing their research data with American scientists. Local justice was often harsh and immediate. French civilians shaved the heads of women who had relationships with German soldiers. Polish resistance fighters executed collaborators without trials. German civilians were expelled from Eastern European countries, where their families had lived for generations. Revenge and justice got mixed together in ways that were impossible to untangle. War crimes investigations continued for decades after the war ended. The last major Nazi war criminal wasn't prosecuted until the 2010s. Some cases are still being investigated today, though the defendants are now in their 90s or dead. Justice delayed became justice denied for many victims. Hollywood prefers clear endings where bad guys get punished and good guys celebrate victory. Real life offered no such satisfaction. Many criminals escaped, many victims never saw justice, and the winning side's crimes were often forgotten or forgiven for political convenience. Understanding these uncomfortable truths doesn't diminish the real heroism that happened during World War II, but it does make the story more honest and complete. War isn't a movie with clear moral lines and satisfying endings. The complexity of wartime justice reveals something else movies often miss entirely. The war's impact on different groups of people varied dramatically, and some of those stories remain largely untold even today. When Hollywood shows World War II, you see the same faces fighting the same battles: white soldiers storming beaches, white pilots in dogfights, white heroes saving the day. But here's what they don't tell you: over 1 million black Americans served in World War II. That's more people than the entire population of some states. Yet most war movies pretend they never existed. The numbers get even more interesting when you dig deeper. Around 350,000 Latino Americans fought in the war. About 25,000 Native Americans left their reservations to join the military. Japanese Americans, despite facing imprisonment in their own country, formed some of the most decorated units in the entire war. These aren't footnotes in history, they're massive chunks of the story that Hollywood keeps ignoring. Makes sense, right? Well, not really. The Tuskegee Airmen became famous because they were exceptional, but movies love to stretch the truth about them too. Hollywood claims they never lost a bomber, they were escorting. Sounds heroic, doesn't it? The real story shows they lost about 25 bombers during escort missions. That's still an impressive record compared to other fighter groups, but the myth of perfection sells better than the truth of excellence. Then there's the bigger picture that films completely miss. Black soldiers weren't fighting alongside white troops in integrated units like modern movies suggest. The military was segregated by law. Black troops ate separately, slept separately, and often got the worst jobs. They unloaded ships, built roads, and drove supply trucks while white units got the glory missions. But here's where it gets frustrating. When black units did see combat, they fought just as hard as anyone else. The 761st Tank Battalion broke through German lines in France. The 332nd Fighter Group shot down enemy planes over Italy. The 969th Field Artillery Battalion fired thousands of shells at Japanese positions in the Pacific. These weren't support roles, these were combat missions that helped win the war. Latino soldiers faced their own weird contradictions. Many came from families that had lived in the Southwest for generations, long before it became part of the United States. Yet they had to prove their patriotism by fighting overseas. Some spoke Spanish at home and English in the foxholes. Private Jose Lopez won the Medal of Honor by single-handedly holding off an entire German company in Belgium. Ever see that story in a movie? Didn't think so. Native Americans brought unique skills that proved incredibly valuable. Many became code talkers, using their native languages to send secret messages that enemy forces couldn't decode. The Navajo code talkers in the Pacific became legendary, but other tribes contributed too. Cherokee, Choctaw, and Comanche speakers all helped keep Allied communications secure. Yet most people only know about this because of one Nicolas Cage movie that got half the details wrong. Let's not forget the most complicated story of all. Japanese Americans were locked up in internment camps while their sons fought in Europe. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team became the most decorated unit in US military history, earning over 18,000 individual awards. These soldiers fought for a country that had imprisoned their families. Think about that irony for a minute. Their motto was "Go for broke," and they lived up to it in every battle. The segregation created absurd situations that would be funny if they weren't so tragic. Black soldiers trained in the South often faced more hostility from local civilians than they would later encounter from enemy troops. Some German prisoners of war could eat in restaurants that wouldn't serve black American soldiers. Italian prisoners worked alongside black troops and couldn't understand why they weren't treated equally. Chinese Americans and Filipino Americans also served, often facing suspicion about their loyalty despite being American citizens. Many had family members still fighting Japanese forces in Asia, giving them personal reasons to hate the enemy. But their contributions rarely make it into the history books, let alone the movies. Here's the weird part: these minority units often performed better than average because they had something extra to prove. They couldn't afford to fail because failure would reflect on their entire race or ethnicity. White soldiers fought for their country, but minority soldiers fought for their country and their people's future acceptance. The irony runs deeper when you consider that America was fighting against Nazi racial theories while maintaining its own racial segregation. German propaganda tried to exploit this contradiction, dropping leaflets asking black soldiers why they were fighting for a country that didn't treat them fairly. Most kept fighting anyway, hoping their service would earn them respect and equality back home. After the war, many of these veterans returned to the same discrimination they'd left behind. The GI Bill helped millions of white veterans buy homes and attend college, but black veterans often couldn't access these benefits due to local restrictions and institutional racism. What makes Hollywood's oversight even stranger is that these stories contain all the drama, heroism, and human interest that make great movies. But we keep getting the same recycled stories about the same white units. Speaking of recycled stories, Hollywood also has a habit of turning real military leaders into cartoon characters. Churchill needed his afternoon naps. Hitler took so many pills his doctor practically ran a pharmacy. Stalin wore platform shoes because he was barely 5 feet tall. World War II movies turn these men into towering giants of history, but the reality? They were human beings with quirks, flaws, and problems that would surprise most people watching Hollywood versions of their lives. Let's start with Winston Churchill. The man movies paint as this unstoppable bulldog who roared defiance at Nazi Germany. Well, he did roar defiance, but he also struggled with what he called his black dog, severe depression that hit him regularly. During some of the war's darkest moments, Churchill would disappear for hours, unable to function. His daily routine included multiple baths, cigars that cost more than most people's weekly wages, and enough whiskey to float a small boat. The man who inspired Britain through the Blitz often worked from bed until noon, dictating speeches while wearing nothing but a towel. Then there's Adolf Hitler, who Hollywood usually shows as either a screaming madman or a cold, calculating mastermind. Reality was weirder and more disturbing. Hitler was a hypochondriac who took over 80 different medications daily. His personal doctor, Theodore Morell, pumped him full of vitamins, hormones and painkillers that probably made him more erratic as the war dragged on. Hitler also had terrible stomach problems, chronic insomnia, and this might shock you, he was terrified of cats. The man who conquered most of Europe couldn't handle being in the same room as a house cat. But here's what movies really miss about Hitler. His decisions weren't made in isolation. He surrounded himself with competing advisors, who spent more time fighting each other than focusing on winning the war. Hermann Goering was addicted to morphine. Heinrich Himmler believed in astrology and ancient German mysticism. Rudolf Hess literally flew to Scotland in 1941 trying to negotiate peace on his own, which even Hitler thought was insane. These weren't evil geniuses, they were damaged people who created a system that rewarded the worst human impulses. Stalin presents maybe the biggest gap between Hollywood and reality. Movies either ignore him completely, or show him as this brutal but effective leader who helped win the war. What they don't show is a man so paranoid he had food testers, slept in different beds each night, and executed generals for winning battles too successfully. Stalin's health was failing throughout the war. He had a withered left arm from a childhood accident, suffered from arteriosclerosis, and had survived multiple strokes that affected his judgment. The Georgian dictator also made decisions based on spite and paranoia that cost millions of lives. When his son Yakov was captured by the Germans, Stalin refused prisoner exchanges, saying he wouldn't trade a marshal for a lieutenant. His son died in German captivity. Stalin purged so many experienced military officers before the war that the Red Army was led by inexperienced commanders who learned strategy through trial and millions of errors. What's fascinating is how these men's personal problems shaped major war decisions. Churchill's depression made him prone to wild swings between optimism and despair, leading to operations like the disastrous Gallipoli campaign in World War I and risky gambles in World War II. Hitler's drug cocktail probably contributed to his increasingly erratic military orders, including his refusal to allow strategic retreats that might have saved German armies. Roosevelt, though less featured in war movies, was literally dying throughout much of the conflict. The man making crucial decisions about D-Day and the Pacific War was suffering from cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, and what was probably cancer. His hands shook so badly during meetings with Stalin and Churchill that he had to hide them under tables. American voters had no idea their president was basically functioning on borrowed time. Even more surprising is how these leaders depended on their staffs for information. Churchill's famous speeches, often written by others and practiced for hours. Hitler's military genius. He relied heavily on reports from generals he simultaneously distrusted. Stalin made decisions based on intelligence reports that subordinates were too terrified to make accurate, leading to disasters like the initial German invasion that caught the Soviet Union completely unprepared. The health issues alone would shock modern audiences. Churchill had 2 heart attacks during the war that were kept secret. Hitler developed a tremor in his left hand that got worse as Germany's situation deteriorated. Stalin's paranoia was likely worsened by his declining mental state from multiple small strokes. Movies prefer their leaders larger than life because it makes better drama. But understanding these men as flawed, sick, and often confused human beings actually makes the war's outcome more remarkable, not less. The fact that such damaged individuals shaped the conflict that determined the fate of the world shows just how chaotic and uncertain those years really were. Speaking of uncertainty, the war's end wasn't the clean, decisive victory Hollywood typically shows us. Hollywood war movies love rolling credits over scenes of ticker-tape parades and soldiers kissing their sweethearts. The war ends, everyone goes home happy, and life returns to normal within minutes of screen time. Real life, not even close. The aftermath of World War II stretched on for decades, creating problems most filmmakers don't want to deal with. Why show the messy reality when you can end with fireworks and feel-good music? But here's what actually happened when the shooting stopped. Soldiers didn't just waltz back into their old lives like nothing happened. Many came home broken in ways nobody understood yet. We didn't call it PTSD back then. It was shell shock or combat fatigue, and most people thought you could just shake it off. Veterans woke up screaming from nightmares for years. Some couldn't hold jobs, others turned to alcohol just to get through the day. The numbers tell the real story. By 1950, over 600,000 World War II veterans were receiving disability payments for psychiatric conditions. That's more than the entire population of Boston at the time. Makes sense, right? You can't send 18-year-olds through hell and expect them to come back unchanged. Then there's the economic reality movies skip entirely. Millions of soldiers returned home looking for work at exactly the same time. Factory jobs that went to women during the war suddenly weren't available anymore. The government promised help with college and housing through the GI Bill, but processing all those applications took years. Many veterans lived in converted military barracks or shared tiny apartments with multiple families. Women faced their own struggles that Hollywood conveniently ignores. After proving they could build planes and run factories, they got told to go back to the kitchen. Some wanted to return to domestic life, sure, but others had tasted independence and didn't want to give it up. The result? Tension in households across America that lasted well into the 1950s. Europe's recovery makes America's problems look minor by comparison. Entire cities needed rebuilding from scratch. Warsaw lost 85% of its buildings. Hamburg looked like the surface of the moon. Millions of displaced people wandered the continent looking for somewhere, anywhere, to call home. The weird part is how long reconstruction actually took. Movies show Europe bouncing back quickly, but reality moved at a snail's pace. London still had bombed-out lots serving as parking spaces into the 1960s. Some German cities didn't finish clearing rubble until the 1970s. Rationing continued in Britain until 1954, 9 years after the war ended. Families torn apart by war faced agonizing reunions. Husbands returned to wives who had learned to live without them. Children barely recognized fathers they hadn't seen in 3 or 4 years. Some marriages that looked perfect on paper crumbled within months. Divorce rates spiked across the Western world, though nobody talked about it much. Let's not forget the political chaos movies gloss over. New borders carved up Europe and Asia, displacing millions more people. The Soviet Union absorbed entire countries. Poland shifted westward like someone picked it up and moved it. Germans living in Eastern Europe for centuries suddenly found themselves unwelcome refugees. War crimes trials dragged on for years, creating uncomfortable questions nobody wanted to answer. The Nuremberg trials made headlines, but thousands of smaller cases clogged courts across Europe. Some criminals got caught immediately, others hid for decades. A few lived normal lives until investigators knocked on their doors in the 1980s. Medical advances from the war created new problems too. Penicillin saved thousands of lives, but soldiers surviving wounds that would have killed them in previous wars needed years of rehabilitation. Prosthetics were crude, physical therapy barely existed. Many disabled veterans struggled with depression and isolation that lasted the rest of their lives. Children who grew up during the war carried psychological scars into adulthood. They'd learn to hoard food, distrust strangers, and sleep through air raid sirens. These kids became adults who couldn't quite believe the danger was really over. Some developed anxiety disorders that puzzled doctors for decades. The economy eventually boomed in America, creating the prosperous 1950s everyone remembers, but that took nearly a decade to develop. The immediate post-war years brought inflation, strikes, and uncertainty. Housing shortages forced newlyweds to live with their parents. Consumer goods remained scarce until factories could retool from making tanks to making toasters. Recovery happened, obviously, we're living proof of that. But it took patience, money, and time that Hollywood finds boring. Real healing measured itself in decades, not movie minutes. The generation that fought World War II spent the rest of their lives processing what they'd experienced. And speaking of processing experiences, the movie industry itself played a huge role in shaping how we remember the war. But their version of victory celebrations tells only half the story about how the fighting actually ended. When Adolf Hitler shot himself in his bunker on April 30th, 1945, Hollywood would have you believe the war suddenly stopped. Roll credits, everyone goes home happy, ticker tape parades fill the streets. The reality? Germany didn't officially surrender until May 8th, and even then, scattered German units kept fighting for days afterward. Some Nazi holdouts in Czechoslovakia didn't get the memo until May 11th. But here's where it gets messy. While Europe celebrated victory in Europe Day, the Pacific War raged on for another 3 brutal months. Japanese forces still occupied vast territories across Asia. The atomic bombs dropped in August didn't create an instant surrender either. Japan's emperor announced surrender on August 15th, but the formal ceremony didn't happen until September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Movies love showing spontaneous street parties the moment peace arrives. Well, those celebrations were real, but they came with complicated emotions. In London, crowds danced in the streets while families quietly mourned sons who'd never return. American soldiers in the Pacific felt forgotten while everyone celebrated the European victory. Many wondered if they'd survive long enough to see their own war end. The surrender documents themselves tell a different story than Hollywood's dramatic single signature moments. Germany signed multiple surrenders, first in Reims, France, then again in Berlin, because Stalin insisted on his own ceremony. Different Allied commanders wanted their moment in history. The Japanese surrender involved representatives from 9 different Allied nations, each with their own agenda for post-war Asia. Then there's the awkward reality of what happened immediately after. Millions of German and Japanese soldiers didn't just vanish when peace was declared. They needed to be processed, fed, and sent home, or in many cases sent to prison camps. Soviet forces kept German prisoners for years, using them as slave labor to rebuild destroyed cities. Some German POWs didn't return home until the 1950s, a decade after the war ended. The geographic confusion of surrender creates more Hollywood headaches. Nazi forces in Norway surrendered separately from those in Denmark. Italian fascists had already switched sides in 1943, but German forces in Italy kept fighting until May 1945. Croatian fascists fled to Austria, hoping to surrender to Americans rather than face Yugoslav partisans. Each region had its own messy ending. What about all those Nazi war criminals who supposedly faced immediate justice? Most escaped in the chaos following Germany's collapse. Adolf Eichmann lived quietly in Argentina until 1960. Joseph Mengele died peacefully in Brazil in 1979, never facing trial. The Nuremberg trials didn't begin until November 1945, 6 months after Germany surrendered, and only prosecuted the most prominent leaders. Movies rarely show the humanitarian disaster that followed victory. 12 million displaced persons wandered across Europe, trying to find home or family. Many discovered their hometowns had been destroyed or given to different countries. Polish families found themselves in the Soviet Union overnight when borders shifted. German civilians fled westward by the millions, often on foot, carrying everything they owned. The weird part is how long occupation lasted. American, British, French and Soviet forces didn't pack up and leave after victory parades. They governed Germany and Japan for years. The American occupation of Japan continued until 1952. Germany wasn't fully reunified until 1990, more than 45 years after the war ended. That's hardly the quick resolution Hollywood suggests. Veterans faced their own complicated homecoming. Unlike movies where soldiers seamlessly returned to normal life, many struggled with what we now call PTSD. Jobs weren't automatically waiting. Wives had learned independence during wartime. Children barely remembered fathers who'd been gone for years. The cheerful boy next door returns home narrative ignored these harsh realities. Even the famous photographs of victory celebrations hide complexity. That sailor kissing a nurse in Times Square. She later said he grabbed her without permission. Hardly the romantic moment movies portray. The raising of the flag at Iwo Jima happened twice because the first flag was too small for good photographs. Reality was messier than the iconic images suggest. Financial costs lingered long after shooting stopped. Britain didn't finish paying its war debts to America until 2006, more than 61 years later. Families received veterans' benefits for decades. War widows in some countries still receive pensions today. The economic impact stretched across generations, not just the immediate post-war period. Perhaps most importantly, the war's political consequences took years to unfold. The Cold War began before the Hot War officially ended, as former allies became suspicious enemies. The United Nations formed in October 1945, but took decades to find its footing. New nations emerged from colonial empires, often leading to fresh conflicts. Hollywood endings suggest problems get solved when bad guys are defeated. But defeating the Axis powers created entirely new problems: refugee crises, territorial disputes, economic collapse and ideological tensions that would shape the next 50 years. The real ending wasn't clean victory, but the beginning of a complicated peace that's still being negotiated today. Speaking of complications that movies prefer to skip, let's examine how Hollywood has distorted our understanding of the weapons that actually won us and lost the war. Hollywood loves its weapon myths almost as much as it loves explosions. The atomic bomb supposedly ended World War II instantly. Right? Wrong. Japan didn't surrender immediately after Hiroshima, on August 6, 1945. They didn't even surrender after Nagasaki 3 days later. Emperor Hirohito announced surrender on August 15. But even then, some Japanese commanders wanted to keep fighting. The surrender ceremony didn't happen until September 2 aboard the USS Missouri. That's nearly a month after the first bomb dropped. Movies make it seem like one flash of light made everyone throw down their weapons. Reality was messier. Japanese military leaders argued for days about whether to surrender. Some tried to stage a coup to prevent it. The atomic bombs were devastating, yes, but they were part of a bigger picture that included Soviet invasion of Manchuria and months of conventional bombing that had already destroyed most Japanese cities. Then there's Germany's so-called wonder weapons that supposedly could have won the war. Films love showing secret Nazi superweapons that were just months away from victory. The V-2 rocket killed about 9,000 people total. Sounds terrible, and it was, but compare that to Allied bombing raids that killed tens of thousands in single nights. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the first operational jet fighter, was impressive but came too late and in too few numbers to matter. Most crashed due to mechanical problems or lack of fuel. German engineers did create advanced technology, but advanced doesn't mean practical. The Maus tank weighed 188 tons and moved slower than a person walking. Only 2 prototypes were ever built. The Gustav railway gun was so big it needed its own railroad tracks and could only fire 7 rounds per day. Engineering marvels. Sure, war-winning weapons. Hardly. Let's talk about flamethrowers since Hollywood uses them constantly. Real flamethrowers were actually rare and incredibly dangerous to operate. The fuel tank on your back made you a walking target, and the range was only about 30 feet. Most soldiers preferred regular rifles. Flamethrowers were mainly used for clearing out bunkers and caves, not for dramatic infantry charges. The operator usually had a very short life expectancy in combat. Movie heroes love their Thompson submachine guns, the famous Tommy gun. Every American soldier seems to carry one in films. In reality, most American infantry carried the M1 Garand rifle. The Thompson was expensive to manufacture and heavy to carry. It weighed over 10 pounds empty, and ammunition was limited. Squad leaders and special units might get them, but your average GI was stuck with the 8-shot Garand. Speaking of the Garand, movies rarely show its most distinctive feature, that loud ping sound when the clip ejected after the 8th shot. Soldiers actually liked this because it meant they knew exactly when to reload. German soldiers supposedly learned to listen for it, but in the chaos of battle, one ping among all the other noise wasn't much help. Tank reliability is another Hollywood myth. Movies show tanks rumbling across battlefields like unstoppable machines. Real tanks broke down constantly. The German Tiger tank was feared for good reason. It could destroy almost any Allied tank, but it spent more time in repair shops than in combat. For every hour of fighting, Tigers needed several hours of maintenance. American Sherman tanks were considered inferior to German Panthers and Tigers in direct combat, but they were reliable and easy to fix. When your tank breaks down behind enemy lines, reliability beats firepower every time. The Sherman could be repaired with basic tools, while German tanks needed specialized equipment that wasn't available in the field. Artillery gets the Hollywood treatment too. Movies show pinpoint accuracy and massive explosions that level entire buildings. Real artillery was effective but far from precise. Forward observers tried their best to direct fire, but communication problems, weather, and simple human error meant shells often landed nowhere near their targets. The psychological effect of artillery was often more important than actual casualties. Grenades in films create enormous fireballs that knock people across rooms. Hand grenades were designed to kill with shrapnel, not massive explosions. The blast radius was about 15 feet, and they didn't create Hollywood-style pyrotechnics. Soldiers learned to throw them and immediately take cover, not dramatically dive away from huge explosions. Machine guns in movies never seemed to run out of ammunition or overheat. Real machine guns required careful ammunition management and regular barrel changes. The German MG-42 could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, but that rate would melt the barrel in minutes. Crews carried spare barrels and had to change them frequently during sustained fire. Even the famous Luger pistol gets mythologized. Movies treat it like some sort of super-accurate death ray. It was actually just a decent pistol that happened to look distinctive. American soldiers wanted them as souvenirs, not because they were superior weapons. But here's what movies almost never show you. The real stories behind all these weapons were often stranger and more interesting than fiction. Some of the forgotten tales from the war make Hollywood's version look boring by comparison. When most people think about World War II, they picture American GIs storming beaches, British pilots in dogfights, and maybe some French resistance fighters. But Hollywood has basically ignored entire nations that fought, bled, and died in this war. Poland, Greece, Canada, India, these countries don't exist in most war movies, even though their stories are incredible. Take Poland for instance. They didn't just get invaded and give up. Polish pilots flew for Britain and became some of the best fighter aces of the war. The 303 Squadron shot down more German planes than any other RAF squadron during the Battle of Britain, yet you'll barely see them mentioned in movies about that battle. Polish codebreakers also cracked early versions of the Enigma machine before the war even started, giving the Allies a huge head start. But somehow that detail gets skipped over. Then there's Canada. Yeah, Canada. They weren't just sitting around being polite during the war. Canadian forces stormed Juno Beach on D-Day and pushed further inland than any other Allied force that day. They liberated the Netherlands and fought brutal battles in Italy. Over 1 million Canadians served, and 45,000 died. But Hollywood treats them like they were handing out maple syrup instead of fighting Nazis. Greece punched way above its weight too. When Italy invaded in 1940, the Greeks didn't just defend themselves, they pushed the Italians back into Albania. This was the first Allied land victory against Axis forces, and it forced Hitler to delay his invasion of Russia by crucial weeks. Some historians think this delay cost Germany the entire war, but you won't find many movies about Greek mountain fighters holding off fascist armies. India's story gets completely erased from most films. Over 2.5 million Indians served in World War II, the largest volunteer army in history. They fought in North Africa, Italy, and Burma. Indian soldiers won more Victoria Crosses than any other nationality except the British. The Bengal famine of 1943 killed millions of Indians, partly because of wartime policies. Yet somehow India's massive contribution disappears from Hollywood's version of the war. Let's not forget the women who did way more than movies show. Virginia Hall was an American spy with a wooden leg who organized French resistance networks. The Soviets had female snipers like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, who killed over 300 German soldiers. Polish pilot Anna Leska flew transport missions across enemy territory. Nancy Wake was an Australian, who became one of the most wanted people by the Gestapo. These women weren't just nurses or factory workers, they were fighters, spies and leaders. The weird part is how many crucial battles never make it to the big screen. Ever heard of the Battle of Kohima? British and Indian forces held off a massive Japanese assault in India, and it's called the Stalingrad of the East. What about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where Jewish fighters held out against German forces for nearly a month with almost no weapons? Or the Battle for the Philippines, where Filipino and American forces fought a desperate defense that tied up Japanese troops for months? Civilian rescue stories get forgotten too. Chiyun Sugihara was a Japanese diplomat who saved thousands of Jewish lives by issuing transit visas against his government's orders. Raoul Wallenberg disappeared after saving tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews. The people of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, a French village, hid thousands of refugees, mostly children. These stories are just as dramatic as any Hollywood action scene, but they don't involve explosions or tank battles. Speaking of tanks, ever wonder why you never see movies about the North African campaign beyond a few desert scenes? Rommel and Montgomery fought back and forth across hundreds of miles of desert for years. Australian, South African, and New Zealand forces played huge roles there. The fighting was brutal, with temperatures reaching 130 degrees, and soldiers dealing with sandstorms, scorpions, and constant thirst. Even resistance movements get simplified. The French resistance wasn't one unified group. It was dozens of competing organizations that sometimes fought each other as much as the Germans. Yugoslav partisans tied down entire German divisions in mountain warfare. Norwegian commandos destroyed heavy water facilities that could have helped Germany build atomic bombs. Dutch resistance workers hid Allied pilots and helped them escape back to Britain. The strangest oversight. Hollywood rarely shows what happened in the Pacific beyond Pearl Harbor, Midway, and maybe Iwo Jima. The Burma campaign involved some of the most vicious jungle fighting of the war. The siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days and killed over 1 million civilians. The Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia displaced millions of people and created refugee crises that lasted for years. But here's what's really wild about all these forgotten stories. They're often more interesting than the ones Hollywood keeps repeating. Real history has more plot twists, unexpected heroes, and dramatic moments than any screenwriter could invent. While movies keep showing us the same battles and the same characters, the untold stories of World War II reveal just how massive and complex this global conflict really was. Hollywood war movies work like a gateway drug to history. They get you hooked on the drama, then leave you craving the real story. That's actually not such a bad thing, as long as you know what you're getting into. The biggest problem isn't that movies get things wrong, it's that they get things wrong so confidently. When you see Tom Hanks storming a beach, or Brad Pitt commanding a tank crew, these scenes feel absolutely real. The actors look convinced. The explosions look convincing. Your brain files it all away as fact, even when half of it never happened. But here's the weird part. Veterans who lived through World War II often love these movies anyway. Sure, they'll grumble about the wrong uniforms or laugh at impossible battle scenes, yet many still watch them because these films capture something true about war, even when the details are fantasy. The fear feels real, the bonds between soldiers ring authentic, the waste and tragedy come through loud and clear. Let's not forget that movie makers face an impossible task. Real war stories are messy, complicated, and often boring. Imagine trying to explain the supply chain problems that delayed D-Day, or the bureaucratic nightmare of getting winter uniforms to freezing troops. Nobody wants to watch 2 hours of logistics meetings and paperwork, even though those mundane details often decided who lived and who died. Then there's the money factor that nobody talks about. Studios spend hundreds of millions making these films look spectacular. They need audiences worldwide to buy tickets, which means keeping things simple and exciting. Complex political situations get boiled down to good versus evil. Confusing military strategies become clear-cut heroic charges. Multiple causes for major events get reduced to single dramatic moments. The real challenge comes when these Hollywood versions become the official story in people's minds. Ask most Americans about World War II, and they'll describe scenes from Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers. These aren't necessarily wrong, but they're incomplete. The war was bigger, stranger, and more complicated than any movie could show. And the weird part is how certain myths stick around decades after being debunked. People still believe German tanks were unstoppable killing machines, when actually they broke down constantly and guzzled fuel. They think American soldiers were all volunteers fighting for democracy, when millions were drafted and just wanted to go home. They imagine battles as non-stop action sequences, when real combat involved days of waiting punctuated by minutes of terror. Entertainment value beats accuracy every single time in Hollywood. Directors know that historically correct uniforms won't save a boring script. Perfect battle chronology means nothing if audiences fall asleep, so they jazz things up, compress timelines, and create composite characters who represent multiple real people. Makes sense, right? But here's where it gets interesting. Some war movies accidentally teach better lessons than intended. When Platoon showed American soldiers fighting each other, it revealed truths about unit cohesion that sanitized films had hidden. When Das Boot portrayed German submariners as human beings instead of cartoon villains, it complicated our understanding of the enemy. Sometimes Hollywood stumbles into honesty while chasing drama. Veterans notice the biggest mistakes immediately because they lived through similar experiences. They know what combat fatigue actually looks like. They remember how equipment really worked under pressure. They understand which heroic actions were possible and which were pure fantasy. Their reactions often provide the best fact-checking available for war films. Well, the solution isn't to stop watching these movies. They serve a purpose by keeping historical memory alive and making younger generations curious about the past. The key is treating them like historical fiction rather than documentaries. Enjoy the story, then dig deeper if you want the truth. True history turns out to be far more fascinating than Hollywood's version anyway. Real World War II included amazing coincidences, bizarre characters, and incredible survival stories that no screenwriter would dare invent. The actual D-Day planning involved weather forecasters, double agents, and inflatable tanks. The real resistance movements included housewives, teenagers, and priests performing acts of quiet courage. The genuine war stories are already dramatic enough without Hollywood's help. Modern audiences have access to resources that previous generations never enjoyed. Veterans' oral histories, declassified documents, and international perspectives provide a fuller picture than any single movie could offer. The challenge isn't finding accurate information, it's wanting to look beyond the simplified Hollywood version. Learning from war movies means enjoying them for what they are while staying curious about what they're not. They're conversation starters, not final answers. They point toward history without being history themselves. And sometimes, just sometimes, they inspire people to dig deeper into the real stories that shaped our world. The best approach: watch the movies, then read the books, talk to veterans, and question everything. History deserves that level of respect.